Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The digital clock on my nightstand clicked to 3:33 a.m. Its red numbers burning into the darkness like a brand I didn't need to see it. To know the time, my body had already jolted awake exactly 17 seconds earlier, as it had done every night for the past 2 weeks. First came the cold, not the ambient chill of my apartment's faulty heating system, but something deeper like ice water replacing the blood in my veins. Then the weight on my chest as if gravity had doubled itself exclusively above my rib cage, and finally the certainty. The absolute undeniable knowledge that I was not alone. My name is Robert Mercer. I'm 52 years old, a senior accountant at Delon Associates. I've never married, never had children. I've lived in apartment 703 at the Westwood for 11 years, a building known for its security and its quiet. Until recently, I cherished that quiet. Now I dread it because in that silence I can hear what doesn't belong. I lay perfectly still, my breath shallow, barely disturbing the sheets pulled tightly across my chest. There it was again, the sound that always followed my awakening. The unmistakable rhythm of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Not the dry click of shoes or the soft padding of bare feet, but the distinct squelch of wet soles pressing against hardwood, leaving moisture with each step. Squish, slap, squish, slap, squish, slap. Something was walking back and forth in my apartment. My rational mind searched desperately for explanations, a pipli creating the illusion of footsteps. The building settling in ways that coincidentally mimicked human movement, but deep down I knew better. The footsteps had purpose. They paced with intent, always pausing at the same spots outside my bedroom door. By the living room window in front of the antique cabinet I'd inherited from my mother the first time it happened, I convinced myself it was a dream. The second night I blamed it on stress tax season was approaching and our firm had just taken on several major corporate clients. By the fifth night I'd called the building manager insisting that someone must be accessing my apartment. He checked the security logs, finding no entries on my floor during those hours. At my persistent urging, he'd even changed my locks. Though the pitying look in his eyes told me he thought I was becoming unhinged, the footsteps grew closer to my bedroom door. I felt sweat beating at my temples. Despite the cold, my heart hammering so violently I feared it might alert the intruder to my wakefulness. The wooden floor outside my bedroom creaked a specific board that always announced visitors, and then silence. Absolute silence. Even the ambient hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic seemed to vanish, as if the world beyond my bedroom had been temporarily erased. The doorknob turned, rotating slowly to the right. I hadn't locked it. What was the point when the presence moved freely throughout my home? Regardless of barriers, the door opened a precise 3 in, then stopped in the gap, nothing but darkness deeper than the shadows of my room. I closed my eyes, a child's defense against the monster in the closet. When I opened them again, the door had returned to its closed position, but I knew the presence had entered. The air in the room had changed, becoming dense and sand like breathing through a wet woolen blanket. I could taste salt on my tongue and smell something ancient, rotting wood, tarnished metal, and sea decay. This had been our nightly ritual for 2 weeks. It would stand there invisible but undeniable, watching me pretend to sleep until precisely 4:17 a.m., when it would leave as suddenly as a candle being extinguished. I would lie awake until dawn, my sheets soaked with sweat, my mind racing between terror and the desperate hope that I was simply losing my sanity because the alternative was somehow worse. But something changed on the 15th night. I awoke to find my collection of antique fountain pens, previously arranged by size. On my desk, rearranged in a perfect circle in the center, sat a small brass button embossed with an anchor. When I picked it up, it was ice cold and damp, as if recently retrieved from the ocean floor. I dropped it as if burned, watching in disbelief as a small puddle formed beneath it, then slowly evaporated over the next few minutes. That same morning, I found wet footprints leading from my front door to the bathroom, then to the living room, and finally ending abruptly in the middle of my kitchen. They weren't the treads of any shoes I owned. These were broader, with an odd square shape to the heel that reminded me of old workman's boots. Like the water from the button, they began to evaporate as I watched disappearing completely. Within 10 minutes, I'd spent my entire life believing in spreadsheets and balanced ledgers in the orderly progression of numbers that always resolve to zero when properly managed in cause and effect and rational explanations. Now at 52, I found myself searching for sage bundles and protective charms online. During my lunch breaks, I declined dinner invitations from colleagues afraid to leave my apartment unattended for too long, yet equally terrified to return to it. My assistant had begun to ask if I was feeling well. I caught her staring at the dark circles under my eyes at my increasingly disheveled appearance. I'd always taken pride in my precision, in my iron shirts and perfectly knotted ties. Now I was lucky if I remembered to comb my hair. Sleep deprivation was eroding me from the inside out, wearing away at my carefully constructed professional facade after the footprints I installed cameras, one in my bedroom, one in the hallway, one in the living room. State-of-the-art motion activated with night vision capabilities. They sent alerts directly to my phone. The first 2 nights they captured nothing. Despite the continuing footsteps, the continuing presence at my bedside on the 3rd night at exactly 3:33 a.m. All 3 cameras triggered simultaneously with trembling fingers. I reviewed the footage the next morning at my office, locking the door to ensure privacy. The hallway camera showed at first a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. Then gradually a figure coalesced, translucent but unmistakably humanoid. It wore what appeared to be an old naval uniform, the kind from centuries past, with a high collar and double row of buttons. Down the front, its face remained indistinct, a blur where features should be, but its hands were clear enough, bloated and pale with fingernails blackened as if with rot. In its arms, it carried something rectangular, approximately 12 inches long and 8 inches high. The camera's night vision rendered colors poorly, but the object gleamed in places suggesting metal fittings. As it moved down the hallway, water seemed to drip from its uniform, forming the footprints I'd found the living room camera captured it next, standing motionless before my mother's cabinet. For 17 minutes, it simply stood there, its form occasionally flickering like a bad television signal. Then it turned, seeming to look directly into the camera, though it had no distinguishable eyes. I felt its gaze, a sensation that translated through technology and time to freeze the blood in my veins. Even in the safety of daylight, the bedroom camera showed my sleeping form. Covers pulled tight, body rigid. Even in unconsciousness, the door opened and the figure entered, moving to my bedside with unnatural smoothness. It stood there looking down at me, the rectangular object now more clearly resembling an ornate box clutched to its chest at 4:16 a.m. It leaned closer, bringing what should have been its face near to mine. At 4:17, it simply vanished, leaving nothing but a damp patch on the floor that quickly evaporated. I couldn't return to my apartment that night. Instead, I checked into a hotel across town, hoping distance would provide relief. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not that there were many who would ask. My life had been a solitary one. By choice, my relationships limited to professional courtesies and occasional meals with acquaintances. I'd never found that loneliness particularly troubling until now, when I desperately needed someone to believe the unbelievable. The hotel room was anonymous and sterile, smelling of industrial cleaner and other people's transient lives. I double-locked the door, wedged a chair beneath the handle, and left every light burning. I took a sleeping pill, something I'd never needed before, and fell into a dreamless void around midnight. I awoke at exactly 3:33 a.m. The hotel room had changed the wallpaper previously. A bland beige now seemed to ripple with moisture, dark patches spreading like spilled ink across its surface. The carpet beneath my feet was sodden, squishing between my toes as I sat up in horror. The bathroom door, which I had left open, was now closed, and from behind it came the sound of water dripping with metronome. Precision, drip, drip, drip. My breath caught in my throat, lungs seizing as if filled with liquid. The chair I'd wedged against the main door remained in place, undisturbed. Whatever was here had not used conventional means of entry. The bathroom door knob turned slowly, Slowly, I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could barely force myself to blink as the door swung open. Steam billowed out hot and thick with that same salon smell through the vapor. I saw it more solid than in the camera footage, but still translucent around the edges. Water poured from its uniform, from its sleeves, from what would have been its hair, forming a growing pool at its feet. It carried the box, which I could now see was indeed an antique music box, ornately carved with nautical scenes, ships battling stormy seas, mermaids and sea creatures. I couldn't identify tarnished brass fittings held it together, and a small key protruded from one side. The figure took a step toward me, another water soused around its heavy boots. It extended the box in gray bloated hands. My voice returned in a rush of terror. I asked what it wanted, why it had chosen me. The figure gave no response, but continued its slow advance box, outstretched like an offering or a demand. I scrambled backward until I hit the headboard, nowhere left to retreat. The figure stopped at the foot of the bed with deliberate slowness. It placed the music box on the mattress and pushed it toward me through the soaked bedding. I felt cold seeping upward. Numbing my legs, something compelled me to reach for it. Not curiosity, but a deeper imperative, as if refusing would bring consequences far worse than compliance. My fingers touched the cold metal, sending electric shivers up my arm. The box was heavier than its size suggested and crusted with what looked like decades of salt and barnacles. The key turned with surprising ease. The lid opened automatically, revealing a mechanism of tarnished gears and a small figurine. A sailor, much like my visitor, poised as if mid-stride on a ship's deck. Music began to play, a haunting melody I somehow recognized, though I was certain I'd never heard it before. Notes plucked at something deep in my memory, something buried beneath years of mundane existence. Images flashed through my mind, a harbor town. I'd never visited a ship with magnificent sails billowing in a storm, a cabin filled with maps and instruments, a mutiny, a captain proud and unforgiving locked in his quarters as the ship foundered in a tempest treasure, meant to pay a crew now sealed in a compartment flooding with seawater, a curse spat with dying breath. The sailor figurine rotated slowly, its tiny face becoming more detailed with each turn, until I recognized it not as anyone I knew, but as someone I had been in another life, another time. The music stopped abruptly. The figure at the foot of my bed wavered, its form becoming more distinct. I could see its face now, or what remained of it. After a century beneath the waves, recognition struck me with the force of a physical blow. It raised one dripping hand and pointed at me. Then at the music box, I understood with sudden terrifying clarity. This wasn't a haunting, it was a reckoning. I fled the hotel at dawn, but I knew it was pointless. Distance meant nothing to my visitor. It had found me across time. It would find me across space. I returned to my apartment. Drawn back by the same inexorable pull that had connected us from the beginning, the cameras remained in place, though I no longer needed them for confirmation. I knew what I had to do that night. I didn't fight to stay awake. I didn't barricade my door or leave the lights burning. Instead, I placed the music box, which had somehow appeared on my hotel bed when I wasn't looking on my nightstand. I showered, dressed in my best suit, and laid down precisely at midnight, hands folded across my chest like a corpse prepared for burial at 3:33 a.m. I opened my eyes to find him standing there, my first mate from a life I'd lived in 1847, the man I'd betrayed, locked in the hold with the others when our ship began to sink, the loyal sailor who had trusted me to lead him safely home, not to doom him to a watery grave for the sake of gold that now lay scattered across the Atlantic floor. He no longer dripped. His uniform was immaculate, as it had been before the storm. His face, once handsome and open, watched me with solemn judgment. He gestured to the music box. I nodded, understanding. At last, I had a debt to pay. Not with my life, but with the remainder of it. The coordinates were locked in the music box's melody. a code only the captain could decipher the location of the wreck of the remains of 27 good men of a treasure that meant nothing compared to the lives it had cost they deserved to be found to be returned to their families, even if only as names on a memorial to be remembered as something more than an accounting error in a shipping company's ledger. As I reached for the music box, my visitor smiled a terrible, knowing expression. We had begun a journey that would consume what remained of my orderly, solitary existence. I would become a obsessed spend. Every penny of my savings be labeled a lunatic by those who had once respected me, but I would find them. It was the only way I would ever sleep through the night again. I turned the key in the lock and the melody began once more. The hum of electronics is supposed to be comforting. That's what I always told myself during those long nights alone in my studio, surrounded by mixers, monitors, and the soft glow of digital waveforms pulsing across my screens. As a sound engineer, I'd spent 20 years training my ears to catch imperfections, a slightly off-key note, an inconsistent reverb tail, the almost imperceptible crackle of a failing condenser mic. My ability to hear what others couldn't had built my reputation. But now that same gift had become my curse. It began 3 weeks ago, the digital. Clock on my studio wall read 3:17 a.m., that Leo hour when the world feels thinnest. I was hunched over my workstation, finalizing the mix for an indie rock band sophomore album. The deadline loomed just days away, and I'd fallen behind schedule after scrapping hours of work that somehow felt wrong. Not technically flawed, just wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Sleep deprivation had become my constant companion, my eyes burning from staring at screens in the dim blue light of my home studio, the track playing a moody, atmospheric piece with layers of reverb and delay suddenly presented an anomaly. A faint, almost imperceptible hiss emerged between the guitar solos, something that shouldn't have been there. I froze. The playback rolled back 30 seconds and listened again with my studio headphones cranked to maximum volume. There it was, a strange frequency riding underneath the music, almost like radio interference, but somehow more deliberate. My first instinct was practical check the recording equipment review. The original stems eliminate technical explanations. I spent hours isolating the track, applying filters to strip away the intended sounds, leaving only this peculiar sonic artifact by sunrise. My notepad filled with technical troubleshooting notes. I had to admit this wasn't a technical glitch. The frequency pattern was too structured, too rhythmic. Almost like speech, but in no language. I recognized sleep eluded me that day when I returned to my studio. The following night, a sense of unease had settled over the familiar space. The corners seemed darker, the air heavier. I told myself it was just exhaustion as I booted up my workstation and opened the isolated frequency track from the night before. My finger hovered over the play button, my heart inexplicably racing. Something primal warned me not to listen again. I pressed play anyway. The frequencies had changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Where before there had been a formless, silent whispering, now there existed a clearer pattern. The cadence had become more pronouncedly speech-like, rising and falling in what sounded like questions and declarations. I ran it through spectral and analysis software, watching the visual representation of the sound twist across my monitor. Like the ring of some alien creature, the display showed frequencies that shouldn't exist within the gear we'd used to record subsonic rumbles and ultrasonic peaks beyond human hearing, yet somehow captured in our session. My hands trembled as I saved the new file. The rational part of my brain offered explanations, interference from nearby radio towers, microphonic cable issues, or even prankster bandmates embedding weird samples. Yet none of these explanations addressed why the sound had changed overnight while the file remained untouched on my secure drives. The third night I arrived at my studio earlier than usual, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The isolated track now played back with crystal clarity, a voice speaking in what sounded like an ancient language, the syllables harsh and guttural. I recorded myself listening to it, watching my own expression shift from professional curiosity to dawning horror as the voice became more distinct with each playback. By the fourth night, I understood fragments of what it said by the fifth. It spoke in halting Portuguese, a language I recognized from past collaboration with a Brazilian metal band but didn't speak myself. I ran the clearest sections through translation software, the results fragmentary, but chilling help-trapped coordinates find before they. The sixth night broke my professional detachment completely. The voice now spoke directly to me using my name, describing my studio, mentioning the coffee mug positioned to my left. With unnerving accuracy, the tremor in my hands had become constant. My mouth remained perpetually dry, despite the gallons of water I consumed. Sleep, when it came at all, filled with nightmares of static-filed corridors and shadowy figures standing just beyond doorways. The voice gave coordinates, repeating them with increasing urgency. Each night for days, I resisted the compulsion to investigate, instead throwing myself into research local history radio phenomena, even paranormal forums where I lurked anonymously, afraid to share my experience directly. Eventually, my search revealed the coordinate significance an abandoned radio research facility about 40 miles outside the city. Operational from 1968 to 1974 before being abruptly decommissioned, the official record cited funding cuts, but local newspaper archives told a different story through carefully worded statements about unexplained technical difficulties and personnel departures. One archived article mentioned the facility's experimental work with extremely low-frequency transmissions designed to communicate with submerged submarines. Another, dated just before the closure, referenced an unspecified incident that had resulted in 3 technicians being hospitalized with acute psychological distress. They had reportedly been monitoring transmissions when something came back through the equipment, something that shouldn't have been possible given the one-way nature of their broadcast system. My rational mind screamed warnings as I found myself researching the most direct route to the facility. I recognized the symptoms of my deteriorating mental state: persistent insomnia, hypervigilance, auditory fixation. The voice had become my obsession, drowning out everything else. I'd stopped working on the album entirely. My professional reputation now at risk when the band called about missed deadlines. I mumbled excuses about technical problems, hearing the concern in their voices as they registered the uncharacteristic tremor in mind. Yesterday I made the drive. The facility sat in a remote clearing surrounded by dense woods, a low-slung concrete building with massive radio towers. Rising behind it, like the skeletal fingers of some buried giant, nature had begun reclaiming the site. Vines crawled up the walls and trees pushed through the cracked parking lot, but the destruction appeared haphazard and incomplete, as if the process of decay itself was somehow unnatural here. The chains on the main entrance had been cut long ago, the doors held shut only by decades of rust. My flashlight beam caught dust motes swirling in patterns that seemed to respond to my breathing. The air inside felt charged like the atmospheric pressure before a lightning strike. The silence was absolute in a way that felt engineered rather than natural, as if the building itself absorbed sound. I navigated through administrative offices still filled with abandoned paperwork, ancient coffee cups, and personal items never reclaimed by their owners. Everything lay exactly as it had been left 50 years ago, suggesting a rapid evacuation. The exit sign still glowed with a faint red light, despite the facility having no obvious power source. Following the architectural plans I'd memorized from county records, I located the main transmission room. The door stood partially ajar, the darkness. Beyond it, absolute, my flashlight beam dissipated unnaturally just beyond the threshold, as if the darkness were consuming the light itself. The metallic taste of fear flooded my mouth as sweat plastered my shirt to my back. Every instinct urged retreat, yet I found myself stepping forward, drawn by a compulsion stronger than terror. Inside, banks of antiquated equipment lined the walls: reel-to-reel tape machines, oscilloscopes, and massive radio transmitters. In the center stood a monitoring station with a single chair facing a large speaker system. The dust covering everything remained undisturbed, save for a single path leading to that chair, as if someone had recently walked to it recently or repeatedly over decades. My flashlight finally failed completely in the perfect darkness. I became aware of a faint red indicator light blinking on one of the consoles. As my eyes adjusted, I saw more lights. Awakening across the equipment panels, systems powering up in sequence though no one had touched them, a mechanical war began as tape reels started turning on their own. The speakers crackled to life with a hiss of static that resolved into the same voice I'd been isolating in my studio, only now without digital mediation. I recognized something familiar in its timbre, something that raised goosebumps along my arms and sent ice water coursing through my veins. It was my voice, older, ragged with exhaustion or pain, but unmistakably mine. The recording explained everything in fragmented sentences, interrupted by bursts of static. How I would become trapped here, how the facility's experiments had torn something in the fabric between dimensions, how the equipment had established a connection that worked across time itself, how I would spend years trying to contact my past self, my messages traveling backward. Through time embedded in recordings I would one day work on, I stumbled backward, colliding with equipment racks that should have toppled but somehow remained rigidly in place. My voice grew more insistent, explaining that I was already caught in the loop, that my presence here had activated something that couldn't be undone, that the transmission facility hadn't been abandoned because of what had come through from elsewhere, but because of what had become lodged here, a splinter of myself fractured across time. The room's single chair swiveled slowly toward me, though no one sat in it. The voice urged me to take the seat to complete the circuit. It promised answers, release an end to the paradox. My limbs moved with dreamlike heaviness as I approached the monitoring equipment. Displayed waveforms identical to those I'd obsessed over in my studio. The visualization of my own voice. Calling across decades, I grasped the edges of the recording console. My fingertips finding grooves worn into the metal grooves that matched the exact spread of my hands. How many times had I stood in this exact spot making this exact choice? In that moment of clarity, I understood my options had already collapsed to one, and yet I turned and ran through darkened corridors that stretched impossibly longer than the building's exterior. Dimensions should have allowed past equipment that activated as I passed tapes, spinning dials, tracking my escape out the main entrance where my car waited, its interior light flaring unnaturally bright. When I opened the door, I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. The engine produced harmonics that matched the frequencies from the recordings. The radio cycled through stations without my touch, fragments of broadcasts merging into messages, meant specifically for me back in my studio. Now I'm recording this account while I still remember, while I still believe it happened, because with each hour that passes, the certainty fades. Reality seems to be revising itself around me. The original recording that started everything, I can no longer find it in my project files. The research about the facility deleted from my browser history, though I never touched it. My reflection in the studio monitors shows exhaustion, but also something else, a subtle asynchronicity. As if my movements register a fraction of a second before I make them. Sometimes in my peripheral vision, I see myself standing in the corner of the room watching with eyes that hold decades of patience. The deadline for the album has somehow reset itself. According to my calendar, I have 3 more weeks, the exact amount of time I had when this all began. The band has no recollection of calling about missed deadlines. My notes about the strange frequency are gone, replaced by mundane mixing observations. But I remember, and I will not return to that facility no matter how compelling the voice becomes. I've disconnected my equipment, replacing everything that might have been contaminated. I've soundproofed the studio, further installed electromagnetic shielding. I will finish this album using only analog equipment, avoiding digital processing entirely. Yet even as I implement these precautions, I notice new frequencies emerging in the background noise of the room. My air conditioner, the refrigerators hum, the electrical current in the walls, all of them carrying fragments of that same message, that same voice, my voice. And sometimes in the deep hours of the night, I catch myself reaching for headphones, fingers poised to isolate new frequencies, to amplify them, to listen just one more time to what they might reveal. In those moments, I feel the future version of myself watching, waiting for the inevitable moment when curiosity overcomes caution, when the loop begins again. The first night in apartment 302, I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the distinct sensation of being watched. My eyes snapped open to darkness so complete it seemed to press against my retinas. The air hung unnaturally still, carrying a faint medicinal smell I couldn't place antiseptic yet. Somehow ancient as my eyes adjusted, I could make out only the vague outlines of unfamiliar furniture boxes still stacked from the move. Nothing appeared out of place, yet something was profoundly wrong. The silence buzzed with a strange electricity that made the hairs on my arm stand rigid. I remained paralyzed in bed until dawn. Gradually revealed an empty room, telling myself that the disorientation was natural. When sleeping in a new place, I didn't yet understand that in this building, emptiness was merely an illusion. My name is Dr. Thomas Reed. At 36, I built a respectable career as a neuropsychiatrist, recently accepting a position at Westlake Memorial Hospital that necessitated my move to this historic building. Downtown Parkview Apartments was constructed in 1926, a grand 7-story brick structure with ornate cornices and an imposing marble lobby. The real estate agent had emphasized its prestigious history, mentioning past residents of significance, judges, professors, a state senator. What failed to mention was the building's other history, the one I'd soon piece together through Whisper's strange encounters and the growing certainty that apartment 302 was not simply a space, but something closer to a condition. The day after moving in, I encountered my first neighbor in the narrow hallway connecting our apartments. Mrs. Avery from 303, a thin woman with steel gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her skin, was locking her door as I exited mine. Upon seeing me, she froze, key suspended. Mid-turn, her eyes widened slightly before narrowing in calculation. I offered a standard greeting, extending my hand and introducing myself as the new tenant in 302. She stared at my outstretched hand as if I'd presented her with a dead animal, then clutched her handbag closer to her body. In a voice barely above a whisper, she asked if I'd been selected for the apartment before I could question what she meant. She hurried past me toward the elevator, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow from behind. That evening, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my door while I was unpacking. It was addressed to the occupant apartment 302, but when I opened it, the letter inside was addressed to someone named Marcus Whitley. The contents were baffling, a single page covered with intricate symbols, forming a circle with text inside reading the convergence approaches. Your attendance at the gathering is both expected and acquired. The signs have been confirmed. At the bottom was a date exactly 1 month from that day, and a crude drawing of what appeared to be my building, but with strange protrusions emerging from its roof. I dismissed it as some odd welcome ritual, or perhaps a mistake, adding it to the growing pile of mail addressed to Whitley that had accumulated since my arrival. Curious, I performed a quick internet search for the name, but found nothing of note connected to my address that night. I heard it for the first time. The murmuring, it began as a subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, emanating from the wall shared with apartment 301. Initially, I assumed my neighbor was watching television or having a conversation, but as I pressed my ear against the cool plaster, I realized the cadence was wrong. The sounds had rhythm, but lacked the natural rises and falls of normal speech. They maintained a constant, monotonous pattern like a prayer or chant repeated endlessly according to the building directory apartment. 301 was vacant over the following days. My attempts to connect with other residents proved increasingly unsettling in the elevator. Conversations would halt abruptly when I entered in the laundry room. Fellow tenants would gather their belongings and leave without acknowledging my presence. Once catching a glimpse of my reflection in the polished brass mailbox panel, I noticed 3 residents standing behind me, watching intently. When I turned, they quickly dispersed, avoiding eye contact. The building manager, a perpetually sweating man named Carlson, seemed the only person willing to engage with me, though even his interactions were strained when I inquired about the previous tenant. His face paled visibly. He claimed such information was confidential, but when pressed, reluctantly mentioned that Whitley had relocated suddenly due to health concerns. When I asked directly about the strange behavior of other residents, he laughed too loudly and suggested that city people were simply more reserved than those in the suburbs. 2 weeks into my residency, I began experiencing time slips. I would sit down to read medical journals at 8 in the evening, only to suddenly find myself staring at a wall of incomprehensible symbols. I'd apparently drawn myself the clock, showing 3 hours had passed. My sleep became fractured by episodes of paralysis during which I could have sworn the ceiling above me rippled like water. Most disturbing were the mornings I woke to find my furniture rearranged in subtle ways, a chair angled differently, my desk moved 3 inches to the left, books reorganized by some system I couldn't decipher. My professional training suggested these might be symptoms of stress, perhaps even the onset of a dissociative disorder. I began keeping meticulous notes of these occurrences, establishing a document timeline. To ground myself, these notes soon revealed patterns. The disturbances intensified during the new moon, subsided briefly, then resumed with greater frequency as the circle of strange mail correspondences addressed to Whitley increased. The most alarming development occurred when I discovered a small door in my bedroom closet previously hidden behind hanging suits. The door, no more than 2 feet square, was secured with 3 separate locks, none of which matched my key set. Around its frame were carved the same symbols that had appeared in the letters addressed to Whitley when I pressed my ear against it. The murmuring I'd heard through the wall seemed to intensify, gaining an almost gleeful quality. My investigation took a deliberate turn when I decided to access hospital records using my medical credentials. I searched for patients named Marcus Whitley. I found 1 deceased in 1978, 1 currently under treatment for liver failure, and 1 admitted to the psychiatric ward 4 months ago with symptoms of extreme paranoia and delusions. The attending physician had noted the patient's insistence that his neighbors were preparing him for some ritual involving the thinning of barriers between worlds. Most telling was the patient address: Apartment 302, Park VIW, Apartments. Further research revealed a disturbing pattern over the past 70 years. 14 residents of Apartment 302 had been admitted to various psychiatric facilities with nearly identical symptoms: paranoia, time distortions, and beliefs about rituals involving the building itself. 5 others had simply disappeared, their cases remaining open in police files. The most recent disappearance prior to Whitley's hospitalization was a woman named Eleanor Simmons, who vanished 3 years ago, leaving behind a journal documenting experiences eerily similar to my own. My pulse quickened as I expanded my research. The land beneath Parkview Apartments had previously housed a meeting hall belonging to an obscure philosophical society founded in the 1880s. The group, calling themselves the Observers of Convergence, had disbanded after a mysterious incident in 1923 that local newspapers vaguely described as a tragic occurrence during an astronomical event. The society symbol I discovered with a stomach-dropping sensation matched exactly the circular pattern appearing on the letters addressed to Whitley. As my investigation deepened, so did the intensity of strange occurrences in my apartment. The murmuring from the walls became audible without pressing my ear against them. Objects would disappear, only to reappear days later in impossible locations. My stethoscope inside a sealed container of coffee, my watch found frozen inside an ice cube in the freezer. Most disturbing was the night I woke to find every reflective surface in my apartment mirrors. Windows, even the screen of my laptop, covered with condensation on which the same symbol had been traced by an unseen hand. My professional rationality began crumbling. I installed cameras that mysteriously recorded only static during the night hours. I scheduled appointments with colleagues to discuss my symptoms, only to find myself inexplicably canceling them at the last minute. With no memory of having done so, my notes became increasingly disorganized. Pages, sometimes rearranged overnight into patterns that, viewed from above, formed larger versions of the symbol. The breaking point came when I received mail addressed to me, not Whitley. For the first time since moving in, the envelope contained a formal invitation to the gathering of Convergence scheduled for the following night in the building's basement, a space I hadn't known existed. The invitation bore the signatures of every resident in the building, including Mrs. Avery from 303, whose signature was notably larger than the others. Most disturbingly, at the bottom of the invitation was my own signature, perfect in every detail. Though I had no memory of signing it that night, the small door in my closet unlocked itself. The series of clicks woke me from shallow sleep, each lock disengaging with a sound like bones. Breaking my bedroom had filled with a thick greenish mist that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. From beyond the now open closet door came not darkness, but a soft pulsating glow. The murmuring had reached a fevered pitch, now clearly recognizable as my own name, repeated in countless voices, each with subtle variations in tone and urgency. My body moved toward the door without conscious command. My medical training screamed warnings about hallucinations, delusions, the need for immediate psychiatric intervention. Yet another part of me, a part growing stronger by the second, recognized something ancient and inevitable in what was happening. The pattern of tenants in apartment 302, the building's history. The convergence mentioned in the letters all seemed to form a coherent narrative, leading to this moment standing before the open closet door. I faced a choice that didn't feel like a choice at all. Beyond the small opening was not the expected building infrastructure, but a vast, impossible space filled with shifting geometries and colors that existed beyond the visible spectrum, somehow perceivable, yet indescribable. Floating within this space were dozens of figures, each wearing the faces of building residents, yet somehow wrong, too symmetrical, expressions too fixed among them. I recognized faces from photographs in my research, previous occupants of apartment 302, including Marcus Whitley and Eleanor Simmons, their expressions tranquil yet vacant. In that moment, professional rationality provided one final desperate theory, a gas leak perhaps causing mass hallucinations and delusions that had affected residents for decades, particularly concentrated in apartment 302. Due to some quirk of the ventilation system, this would explain the consistent symptoms, the shared delusions, the building's troubled history. I grasped this explanation like a drowning man clutching driftwood, even as the figures beyond the door extended their hands toward me in perfect synchronization. I stumbled backward, the cold sweat of terror drenching my clothes with tremendous effort. I forced the small door closed and fled the apartment. Racing down 7 flights of stairs, I burst into the night air, gasping as if surfacing from deep water. I spent the night in my car, shivering. Despite the warm spring temperature, watching the windows of Park View apartments. Every window was dark except for 302, which pulsed with that same greenish light I'd seen in my bedroom morning, found me exhausted but resolute. I would not return to the apartment except to retrieve essential belongings, and even then, not alone. I contacted a colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, explaining I needed her help with an urgent matter. She agreed to meet me at the building that afternoon upon our arrival. The lobby was deserted. The elevator responded immediately to my call, something that had never happened before as we ascended to the 3rd floor. Sarah commented on the building's unusual silence. The hallway to 302 stretched longer than I remembered the numbered doors, seemingly farther apart. At my apartment door, I hesitated, key in hand, as Sarah placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. The apartment we entered was immaculate. Not a single sign of the previous night's events. No condensation on surfaces, no rearranged furniture, no green mist. Most significantly, the small door in my closet had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. Sarah explored the apartment with clinical interest while I stood frozen in the center of the living room, unable to reconcile this normalized space with my experiences. As Sarah examined the stack of mail addressed to Whitley, her expression grew concerned. She pointed out what I had somehow missed. Every letter bore the same postmark date. Despite arriving over several weeks, more alarmingly, they all listed my name as the sender. Knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Mrs. Avery stood in the hallway, her severe expression softened into something like pity. She explained that she was heading the residence committee and wanted to personally invite me to a building meeting that evening in the community room. Something in her too wide smile and unwavering gaze triggered a cascade of warning signals in my mind when Sarah introduced herself as my colleague. Mrs. Abernathy's expression flickered briefly to confusion, then back to that fixed smile. She insisted the meeting was for residents only. but we were welcome to speak privately in her apartment to discuss any concerns. I declined politely, citing work commitments. As Mrs. Avery turned to leave, she paused, remarking that I seemed much more adaptable than Mr. Whitley had been. The observation was delivered with such cold calculation that even Sarah, who had heard none of my previous experiences, tensed visibly beside me. After gathering essential belongings, we left Parkview Apartments in Sarah's car. I finally shared the full extent of my experiences and research, rather than dismissing them. She listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her genuine concern. When I finished, she offered not psychological diagnosis, but a key to her guest room, insisting I stay there until I could find new accommodations that evening. Watching the local news in Sarah's apart across town, a brief segment caught my attention. A small fire had been reported at Parkview Apartments, specifically in Unit 302. No injuries were reported and damage was contained to that single unit. The cause was under investigation, but initial reports suggested an electrical issue. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from Carlson, the building manager. The apartment had been declared uninhabitable due to fire damage, and my security deposit would be refunded in full. Enclosed was a check and a short handwritten note. The gathering has been postponed. Your participation will be required at a later date. We have your forwarding address. I moved to a different city the following week, accepting a position at a smaller hospital that represented a step down in my career. I've changed my phone number, deleted social media accounts, even considered changing my name. Yet sometimes in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear the murmuring again. My name repeated in countless variations, growing steadily closer, and I wonder how long until apartment 302 finds me again. The first night I slept at Thornwood Estate, I woke at precisely 3:17 a.m. to the sound of scratching. Not the familiar scratching of branches against windows or rodents and walls, but the methodical scratching of pen against paper, close, persistent, impossible. I sat upright in my temporary bed, surrounded by tarps and construction materials, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound stopped abruptly. The darkness pressed against my eyes as I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the old house settling in my own shallow breathing. I told myself it was nothing, just the mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar place. But even as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes watching from the darkness. Regarding me with cold curiosity, my name is Daniel Mercer, and I've been an architect for nearly 15 years, specializing in historical renovations. When Catherine Blackwood contacted me about restoring her family's rural guest house, a Victorian structure that had stood abandoned for decades on the edge of her estate, I jumped at the opportunity. The Blackwood family was well known in architecture, owl circles for their patronage of distinctive buildings, and this project promised both a healthy commission and potential portfolio. Prestige, what I didn't expect was to find myself questioning the very foundations of reality. The guest house sat a quarter mile from the main estate, partially concealed by a stand of ancient oaks. Its faded grandeur was evident even beneath decades of neglect. Intricate woodwork framing tall windows, a wraparound porch with delicate latticework, and steep gables that pierced the sky like accusations. M. Blackwood, a thin woman with prematurely silver hair, had been oddly perfunctory when showing me around the property. She informed me that the guest house hadn't been used since the 1970s, quickly pointed out structural concerns, then left me to my assessment with an offhand comment that the place always gave her a certain discomfort. At the time, I attributed her behavior to the typical eccentricity of wealthy clients. 3 weeks into the restoration, I discovered the hidden space while examining what appeared to be an anomaly in the blueprints, a section where interior dimensions didn't match exterior measurements. I found a seam in the wooden paneling of the master bedroom. It took considerable effort to pry open the concealed door, its edges sealed by decades of paint, and settling behind it lay a narrow space barely 4 feet wide but running the length of the wall, a secret passage of sorts. The air inside carried tar, the dense, undisturbed must of long abandonment, thick with dust and the sweet, sour smell of decaying paper. That's where I found the diary, a leather-bound journal wedged on a small shelf, its cover cracked and faded to the color of dried blood. I should have reported the find to Miss Blackwood immediately instead, driven by a curiosity I now recognize as my undoing. I took it to my workstation and began reading. That evening, by the harsh light of a construction lamp, the diary belonged to one Edward Harlow, dated 1962. Harlow described himself as a visiting colleague of Richard Blackwood, staying at the guest house while collaborating on academic research. His early entries were mundane observations about the property notes on his work, complaints about the rural isolation. Then, roughly 3 weeks into his stay, the entries changed. Harlow began documenting strange occurrences, personal items rearranged while he slept. The persistent sensation of being watched and whispers that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. I should have been skeptical. The rational part of my mind insisted this was merely the record of a man's psychological deterioration, perhaps triggered by isolation. Yet, as I read his increasingly frantic entries, a heavy dread settled in my stomach because I had noticed things too small, things I'd dismissed tools that weren't where I'd left them. Cold spots in rooms despite the summer heat, the sound of footsteps overhead when I knew the upper floors were empty. The following morning, I arrived early to continue work on the East Wing. The moment I stepped through the door, I sensed something had changed. The house felt alert, expectant. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that reading the diary had simply primed my imagination for ghostly encounters. I focused on my work, meticulously measuring the parlor for restoration of the original crown. Molding around midday, I took a break to review my notes and felt my blood freeze in my veins. Alongside my neat architectural notations were phrases I had no memory of writing. The whispers are clearer at night. They know I found it. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, yet slightly altered. The loops more pronounced, the pressure heavier on downstrokes. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. Trying to recall writing them, nothing. I flipped through the notebook, finding more unfamiliar notations scattered throughout. Check behind the fireplace. The east bedroom window is where he saw it. First, don't sleep in the house. My hand shook so badly I dropped the notebook. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps I'd written the notes while half asleep, or maybe stress was causing brief dissociative episodes. I didn't believe either explanation, but they were preferable to the alternative, that something in this house was reaching into my mind. Guiding my hand, I sought refuge in work, driving myself to exhaustion with physical labor, ripping out rotted floorboards, stripping layers of wallpaper, anything to occupy my hands and quiet my mind. When evening came, I forced myself to leave, despite a strange relent that tugged at me like an invisible thread. That night in my apartment, I compared the diary's handwriting to my own mysterious notes. The resemblance was uncanny, not identical, but as if the same hand had written both with decades between. I barely slept the next week, brought escalating disturbances. I began finding pages torn from Harrow's diary, placed in locations I was about to work on, always featuring passages relevant to that specific area when I started restoring the dining room. Wainscoting a page describing whispers emanating from that very wall appeared on my toolbox before examining the upstairs plumbing. Found a crumpled page detailing Harrow's encounter with a mirror that showed reflections that moved independently. I considered abandoning the project, but couldn't bring myself to do it. Whether from professional pride, financial necessity, or something darker I couldn't name, I felt compelled to continue. Instead, I decided to spend a night in the guest house, hoping to either confirm my fears or dispel them. I told no one of my plans, simply bringing a sleeping bag and basic provisions after my crew left for the day. The house transformed after sunset shadows stretched and contracted in ways that defied the movement of my work. Light the floorboards released sighs and moans that seemed to form half-words. I positioned myself in the parlor, Harrow's diary beside me, and waited for hours. Nothing happened beyond the normal settling of an old structure. Then at 3:17 a.m., the precise time I'd awakened during my previous overnight stay, the temperature plummeted. My breath clouded before me as I huddled deeper into my sleeping bag, watching the doorway with wide eyes. The scratching began that same sound of pen on paper. It came from everywhere and nowhere. I fumbled for my flashlight, casting its beam around the empty room. The sound continued, growing more frantic, then silence. I heard footsteps crossing the floor above me. Deliberate and measured, a door opened and closed. More footsteps now on the stairs. Paralysis gripped me, my muscles locked, refusing to obey the desperate commands to run. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, paused, then continued toward the parlor. I sat rigid, heart thundering, mouth dry as sand, as I watched the empty doorway. Nothing appeared yet. The footsteps entered the room, circling my position with deliberate slowness. The air around me moved as if disturbed by someone or something. Examining me from all angles, I felt breath on the back of my neck, cold, stale wrong, and a whisper too faint to decipher. When my paralysis finally broke, I scrambled backward until I hit the wall, sweeping my flashlight in Y arcs through the empty room. The presence retreated, and with it the unnatural cold. I spent the remainder of the night pressed against the wall, too terrified to close my eyes. Waiting for dawn with desperate intensity, the morning light brought no comfort as I gathered my things to leave. My eyes fell on the diary, open to a page I hadn't read before. The entry described my exact actions from the previous night, written in handwriting that was a perfect fusion of Haarstyle and my own. The final line read, "Soon, you'll understand that the house doesn't just record it, transforms." I should have left, then reported myself ill and never returned. Instead, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain, I continued the restoration. My crew noticed my deterioration, the dark circles under my eyes, my jumpiness, my tendency to stare at walls as if listening for something. Beyond them, they attributed edit to project stress and deadline pressure. I let them believe it. The diary continued its impossible chronicle, adding new entries that detailed my experiences before they happened. I began finding my own notebook filled with detailed plans for modifications to the house, alterations I would never consciously consider designed to recreate the building's original configuration, including hidden spaces and sealed rooms. Not in any official blueprint, my handwriting continued, its gradual metamorphosis becoming increasingly indistinguishable from Harlow's worse. I began experiencing blackouts, moments where time simply vanished. I would find myself in different rooms with no memory of how I got there, tools in my hands that I didn't remember picking up. Working on modifications I hadn't planned during one such episode, I apparently dismissed my entire crew early, telling them I needed to focus on specialized work. I have no recollection of this, only returning to awareness at sunset alone in the house, standing before a wall I'd partially demolished to reveal another hidden compartment. Inside was a collection of diaries identical to Harlow's, each bearing different names and dates spanning back to the house's construction. In 1879, I pulled one at random belonging to a Margaret Woodhill dated 1923 and found the same progression: curiosity, discovery, paranoia, and ultimately transformation with shaking hands. I opened the last pages of Harrow's diary, which I'd previously avoided. Dreading what I might find, the final entry was dated exactly 1 month after the discovery of the hidden passage. The transition is nearly complete. I understand now this house was designed as a vessel, not for habitation, but for preservation. The walls don't merely contain space, they contain consciousness. I am not the first to be absorbed, nor will I be the last. Each of us adds to the collective, each of us strengthens the whole. I no longer fear. The whispers, "Soon I will be." The whispers. The signature at the bottom began as Edward Harlow, but transformed mid-name into something illegible, as if the writer's identity dissolved during the very act of claiming it. That night I fled the estate with both Harlow's diary and my own notebook, driving aimlessly until exhaustion forced me to stop at a roadside motel in my room. I spread my notes across the bed, desperately searching for a pattern, an explanation, anything that might help me understand what was happening around 3 a.m. I surrendered to fatigue, collapsing into uneasy sleep. I dreamed of the house, its walls breathing, its floors pulsing with collected consciousness. In the dream, I walked its corridors with perfect familiarity, my fingers trailing along surfaces that responded to my touch like living skin behind each wall. Voices murmured in welcome. I belonged there. I had always belonged there. The house had been waiting for me. I woke gasping, clawing my way back to reality. Dawn light filtered through cheap curtains as I scrambled to check my notebook. New writing-covered pages I was certain had been blank detailed sketches of the guest house, with annotations indicating further hidden chambers, and a meticulous construction schedule for renovations that would take exactly 1 more month to complete. The handwriting was no longer a hybrid of styles. It was Edward Harrow's precise and fluid, with no trace of my own hesitant architect's scroll. As I stared at the pages, my phone chimed with a text from M. Blackwood. Mr. Mercer, my security system shows you on the property at 3:17 this morning, making unauthorized structural changes. Kindly explain yourself. I haven't returned to the Thornwood guest house. I've fabricated excuses to Miss Blackwood about a family emergency requiring my immediate attention. She's been surprisingly understanding, suggesting I take all the time I need before resuming work. The house has waited this long, she wrote. It can wait a little longer. My hands shake constantly. Now I check my notebook obsessively for new entries, new EV evidence that whatever consciousness resides in that house has followed me. Most nights I dream of hidden passages and whispered conversations in the dark. Sometimes I wake to find myself writing fluid, confident strokes, detailing plans for my inevitable return to Thornwood. Yesterday I received a package, no return address. No note enclosed inside was an empty leather-bound journal identical to Harrow's diary, but pristine, unused on the first page, a single sentence in handwriting that perfectly matches what mine has become. When you're ready to continue your work, we'll be waiting. I've locked the journal in my safe, but sometimes at night I hear scratching from inside, the sound of pen on paper, recording thoughts I haven't yet had, plans I haven't yet made, and a return journey I haven't yet taken, but somehow know is inevitable because the most terrifying realization isn't that the house is haunted. It's that part of me is already there, waiting for the rest to follow. Static crackles like brittle bones breaking in the darkness. The basement air hangs heavy thick with dust and the metallic scent of old wiring. I sit alone, bathed in the sickly glow of this perfect relic, a 1938 Philco radio console, its wooden cabinet gleaming as if it had just left the factory floor. No scratches, no wear, an impossibility in a house that had stood abandoned for nearly a decade before I purchased it. My fingers tremble slightly as they hover over the dial, anticipating the sudden cessation of white noise that comes precisely at midnight. That's when I'll hear the voice again. My voice announcing tomorrow's catastrophes with the practiced cadence of a seasoned broadcaster. I've always had an eye for forgotten treasures. At 46, my modest success as an Ananke dealer had finally afforded me this Victorian fixer-upper on the outskirts of Millfield the previous owners had vacated. Suddenly, something about a family emergency that required immediate relocation. The realtor had been vague, but the price was too good to pass up. After signing the papers, I spent the first week exploring every creaking floorboard and shadowed corner of my new possession. The basement door had been sealed shut with multiple locks. I assumed it was to keep out intruders during the property's vacant period. When I finally broke through, I discovered a space, untouched by time, dry clean, and preserved in a way that contradicted the home's general state of disrepair. Against the far wall sat the radio unplugged, yet somehow humming with an energy I could feel in my MERS. It was a collector's dream. I estimated its value at several thousand or. Assuming the internal components were intact when I plugged it in, the tubes glowed warmly, but every frequency yielded only static. I spent hours tinkering with it. That first night convinced such a pristine specimen must function around midnight, exhausted and ready to admit defeat. I turned to leave when the static abruptly ceased. A voice cut through the silence with perfect clarity. My initial thought was that I'd accidentally tuned into a late night news broadcast. The announcer spoke of a bridge collapse on Highway 16 with multiple injuries and traffic backed up for miles. I made a mental note to avoid that route during my supply run the next day. It wasn't until my morning coffee, when I overheard two customers discussing a freak accident that had just occurred, that ice began creeping through my veins. The bridge on Highway 16 had indeed collapsed exactly as described not by last night's news, but by this morning's. The radio had announced it nearly 12 hours before. Before it happened over the following weeks, a pattern emerged each night at precisely midnight. The static would clear for exactly 2 minutes and 13 seconds. The announcer would detail between 3 and 5 events set to occur the next day: a warehouse fire, a politician's sudden resignation due to scandal, a chemical spill forcing evacuations. Each prediction materialized with eerie precision, always resulting in chaos, injury, or public panic. I began documenting everything. My basement transformed into a conspiracy theorist's lair, walls plastered with newspaper clippings confirming the radio's predictions, notebooks filled with transcriptions, multiple recording devices capturing each midnight broadcast. The voice never wavered in its professional detachment, reciting tomorrow's disasters with the emotional distance of someone reading a grocery list. After 3 weeks, I worked up the courage to warn someone the radio had announced a major structural failure would occur at the Westfield Mall. I contacted mall security, local police, even the fire department. They listened with thinly veiled skepticism as I struggled to explain my source. Without sounding completely deranged, one officer suggested I might need professional help, gently providing a card for a mental health crisis line. The mall remained open. The food court ceiling collapsed at 3:17 p.m., exactly as predicted, causing dozens of injuries amid the panic. My sleep deteriorated. Dark shadows formed under my eyes. My hands developed a perpetual tremor. Clients at my antique shop began asking if I was ill. I couldn't explain that I spent each night in dread, waiting for midnight, documenting disasters I could neither prevent nor ignore. The weight of foreknowledge pressed against my chest like a concrete slab. Then the broadcast changed. Local resident Margaret Whitaker will suffer a severe allergic eye reaction at tomorrow's charity luncheon. The voice announced one night. My fingers went numb. Margaret was my next-door neighbor, a kind woman who occasionally brought over homemade bread. The next day, I canceled my appointments and followed her to the lunch. When she reached for a cookie on the dessert tray, I accidentally bumped into her, causing her to drop it. She laughed it off. Hours later, the event organizer announced that several people had experienced reactions to undeclared nuts. In those same cookies, the broadcast grew increasingly personal. Business associates, the mailman, the barista at my regular coffee shop, each prediction more specific, more intimate. I began warning them with fabricated excuses, telling my business partner Thomas that I'd heard rumors about electrical issues at the conference venue where he was scheduled to present. Convincing him to withdraw, the venue's power failed mid-event, trapping dozens in elevators and darkened hallways through it all. Something else was changing, something that sent cold sweat trickling down my spine. Even as I meticulously logged each prediction, the voice was shifting. The professional broadcaster's tone remained, but subtle inflections. Certain pronunciations began to sound disturbingly familiar. I started recording my own voice, comparing it to the radio announcements. The similarities were undeniable. Last night marked 30 days since I discovered the radio. I descended the basement stairs, each step heavier than the last. The console gleamed in the darkness, tubes already warmed. Though I hadn't turned it on, I no longer needed to. It activated itself at 11:55 p.m. Now static, growing steadily louder until midnight struck. My recording equipment stood ready. My notebook lay open to a fresh page. 11:59 p.m. The static rose to a crescendo. My teeth vibrating with its intensity, then silence, clean and absolute. This is an emergency broadcast. My voice, unmistakably mine, now spoke from the radio with perfect calm. Tomorrow afternoon, local antique dealer and resident of 1478 Oakwood Lane will make a disturbing discovery in his basement wall while attempting to destroy the Philco radio console currently in his possession. My pen clattered to the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I feared they might crack. This was new. The radio had never before acknowledged its own existence, or my attempts to document its broadcasts. Upon breaking through the plaster, my voice continued. He will find evidence connecting the home's previous 5 owners to a series of unexplained disappearances dating back to 1939 when the radio was first Manufactured. Each owner attempted to destroy the radio before becoming the voice of the broadcast themselves. The room tilted around me. Black spots danced in my vision. I had researched the house's history, but found records only going back 30 years. 5 owners, 5 voices. Now mine, the current owner, will then realize the nature of his predicament, that he is both broadcaster and recipient, prophet and audience. That time is not linear for those connected to the radio, but rather a closed circuit, endlessly repeating sweat poured down my face. Despite the basement's chill, I lunged for the radio fingers, scrabbling for the power cord, but it continued broadcasting. Despite being unplugged in his panic, he will attempt to flee the house, only to find himself unable to cross the property line. His subsequent efforts to contact the outside world will fail, as his phone service, internet connection, and other communication methods inexplicably malfunction. My legs gave out. I collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, the radio's light casting my shadow large and distorted against the wall. The authorities concerned after his uncharacteristic absence from work will conduct a welfare check. They will find the house apparently empty with no sign of disturbance or foul play. The case will eventually be classified as an unexplained disappearance. The house will be sold to a new owner and the cycle will continue. The broadcast ended, static resumed. I remained on the floor until dawn. Broke mind racing through possible escapes. I tested my voice's claim immediately. Racing up the stairs and out the front door, only to find myself re-entering through the basement door. My phone showed no signal, my computer connected to no networks. Morning has come and gone. I've spent hours examining every inch of the basement, looking for clues for evidence for anything that might explain or end this nightmare. As afternoon approaches, I find myself drawn to a section of wall behind the radio that seems to sound hollow when tapped. My tools lie nearby. I know what I'll find if I break through that plaster. I know because I've already announced it. The most terrifying realization isn't that I'm trapped or that I've joined some supernatural broadcasting network. It's the growing suspicion that I've always been here, that my memories of finding this house of my life before it are implanted. Fabrications that I've been both predicting and experiencing disasters in an endless loop, a temporal or robos with the radio at its center. The hammer feels heavy in my hand as I approach the wall. Part of me wants to resist the broadcast prediction, to defy the script I apparently wrote myself. But I've transcribed enough of these predictions to know their inevitability. My arm rises of its own accord, the hammer arcing toward the suspicious section of wall. Whatever I discover in the next few minutes, I'm certain of one thing. When midnight comes again, the static will give way to my voice, and somewhere someone else will be listening. Perhaps the next owner of this house, the next voice of the broadcast, the next link. In this chain of prophets trapped in a hell of foreknowledge without power, and the broadcast will continue, uninterrupted here. There is something watching me from the corner of my study. I can feel it, a presence that wasn't there before I visited those woods. My hand trembles as I write these words. Not from age, but from the bone-deep certainty that I've unleashed something ancient and patient into my life. The shadows in my peripheral vision move with purpose. Now my academic rationality is eroding hour by hour like a shoreline against a rising tide, and the worst part, some terrible newfound part of me welcomes it. 3 weeks ago, I was just Professor Alan Mercer, a respected anthropologist at Westlake University, known for my work on comparative folklore and ritual practices. Now I'm not certain what I am becoming. It began with research for my new book on regional folklore. The university library's special collections yielded an unusual find. A journal from 1887 belonging to a local doctor who had documented strange rituals performed by an isolated community that once inhabited the forest 20 miles north of town. The descriptions were meticulously detailed: a stone circle, specific arrangements of natural objects, peculiar phonetic transcriptions of chants. The doctor theorized these practices predated European settlement, possibly representing a previously undocumented indigenous tradition. My academic curiosity was piqued. The journal referenced landmarks that still existed. A distinctive crooked oak, a stream that split around a large boulder, a clearing where the stone circle supposedly stood. With GPS coordinates extrapolated from the doctor's notes, I set out one crisp October morning to locate the site. Just another field trip and a career full of them. The forest was unusually quiet that day. No birdsong, no rustling underbrush. Just the occasional whisper of wind through dying. Leaves, I remember thinking it was perfect weather for field work. No distractions, how wrong I was. I found the stone circle exactly where the journal indicated, though most stones had sunk deep into the earth over the centuries, their tops barely visible among the fallen leaves and moss using a soft brush. I cleared debris from the exposed surfaces, revealing intricate spiraling patterns carved into the dark stone. They seemed to shift under my gaze as if the grooves were filled with something liquid rather than shadow. The symbols resembled nothing in my extensive knowledge of Native American or European iconography. They felt older somehow, their design elements lacking the cultural markers I'd expect. I photographed everything. Made sketches, took measurements, then driven by what I told myself was scholarly thoroughness. I arranged some nearby fallen branches in the pattern described in the journal. It wasn't a full recreation of the ritual. I had no intention of performing the chants or completing the final arrangements. I was merely documenting, visualizing the anthropological record. At least that's what I told myself as I placed the final stick and stepped back to observe my handiwork. A sudden gust of wind scattered the leaves at my feet, swirling them into a brief vortex before they settled again. Nothing dramatic, nothing to indicate I had done anything more significant than arrange sticks in a forest clearing. I packed my equipment and hiked back to my car, already planning the chapter. This would feature, and the first changes were so subtle I dismissed them 3 days after my forest visit. I noticed the ivy my garden wall had grown nearly 6 inches overnight, its tendrils forming what appeared to be concentric spirals. I attributed it to the unusually warm autumn we were having when my neighbor's normally skittish cat began sitting on my porch railing for hours, staring unblinkingly through my window. I assumed it had simply grown accustomed to my presence a week after the forest. I woke at 3:17 a.m., the exact time I later realized that I had completed the stick arrangement in the clearing. My home office was illuminated by moonlight that seemed to pool unnaturally on my desk, highlighting the photographs of the stone carvings half asleep. I shuffled to my desk and found myself tracing the patterns with my fingertip. The symbols suddenly made perfect sense, as clear to me as English they spoke of thresholds of entities that exist in the spaces between places of consciousness that could be transferred like water poured from one vessel to another. I jerked my hand away, heart pounding, mouth dry with fear. I stumbled back to bed, convinced it was just a dream state, a hypnopompic hallucination. But in the morning, the knowledge remained. I could read the symbols as easily as the morning newspaper. My colleague Sarah noticed my distraction during a department meeting. She asked if I was feeling all right, mentioned that my hands were shaking. I dismissed her concerns with vague excuses about too much caffeine and not enough sleep. In truth, I was seeing things that shouldn't be there. Shadows moving against the flow of light plants, bending toward me as I walked past birds, arranging themselves in those same spiral patterns on telephone wires. When I tried to point these phenomena out, no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. Sarah suggested I consider taking some time off, her voice carrying the kind of careful concern reserved for those experiencing mental health crisis. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps this was simply exhaustion coupled with an aging mind. Susceptibility to suggestion, I resolved to take a week's vacation to rest and reset my perspective. That night marked the beginning of the dreams. I closed my eyes in my bedroom but opened them in the forest clearing. Everything was sharper, there more vivid than reality. Colors, more saturated sounds, more distinct smells, more complex. The stone circle glowed with a faint luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat, and I wasn't alone. They lurked just beyond the circle forms that seemed composed of forest debris and shadow, vaguely humanoid but wrong in ways my waking mind couldn't fully process. They whispered in a language that scraped at my consciousness, yet I understood every word. They were ancient. They explained without speaking they had been there before. Humans walked upright before mammals, before the trees. They existed in a layer of reality adjacent to our own, able to observe but rarely interact except through rituals like the one I had begun. I woke drenched in sweat. My sheets twisted around my legs like binding ropes. Morning light streamed through my window, but it brought no comfort. The dream had been too vivid, too coherent to dismiss, and there on my forearm was a perfect spiral pattern pressed into the skin as if I'd slept on something that left an impression. But my sheets and mattress bore no such pattern. Over the next few days, my home became a place of subtle wrongness. The plants in my garden grew explosively, their stems and leaves forming those same spiral patterns. Birds congregated in my yard in unnatural numbers, falling silent when I appeared, their heads turning in unison to track my movements. At night, I would catch glimpses of something moving through my house, not a physical presence, but a disturb in the air like heat. Shimmer given form, my dreams continued to take me back to the stone circle each night. The entities, I had begun to think of them as the Watchers, moved closer, their forms becoming more defined. They were teaching me things, how to see the currents of energy flowing through living things, how to understand the language of roots and fungi, how to perceive the slow thoughts of stones. I began to suspect that these weren't dreams at all, but actual journeys. My consciousness was being drawn out of my body while I slept, pulled back to the ritual site to continue what I had unwittingly started. I tried staying awake, coffee, energy drinks, loud music, cold showers. Nothing worked for long. Eventually, exhaustion would claim me and I would find myself back in the clearing. Once in desperation, I drove to a hotel 50 miles away. It made no difference. Distance seemed meaningless to whatever force now had its hooks in my mind. My waking hours became increasingly difficult to navigate. I canceled my classes claiming illness. I stopped answering calls from colleagues. Food lost its taste. Music, its melody, only the symbols from the stones held any meaning. Now I began carving them into my furniture, painting them on my walls, arranging my possessions in spiral patterns without realizing I was doing it. Until the task was complete, the Watchers told me I was changing, becoming a bridge. The ritual I had begun was a transformation, not an invocation. They had been waiting for centuries for someone to re-establish contact. The doctor whose journal I had found had done the same. They revealed but had resisted the completion of the process. I saw his fate during one of my dreams, his mind fractured as he fought against the transformation, leaving him a hollow shell confined to an assault until his body eventually surrendered. I understood then that I had two choices: complete the ritual or destroy my mind in resistance. Yesterday, I returned to the stone circle in my physical form. For the first time since that initial visit, the forest seemed to welcome me, branches bending to clear my path, animals emerging to watch my passage with knowing eyes. The clearing had changed. The stones had risen further from the earth, their carvings freshly distinct as if newly cut. The stick arrangement I had made remained untouched by 3 weeks of autumn weather. I knew what to do without consulting the journal. My body moved with certainty. Gathering specific leaves, arranging certain stones, digging small holes at precise points around the circle. As the sun began to set, I positioned myself in the center and began to speak words I had never learned, yet somehow knew perfectly. The air thickened around me, the boundaries between worlds growing thin. I felt them then, not just watching, but reaching through tendrils of consciousness, brushing against my mind. The sensation was electric, terrifying, exhilarating. This was what anthropologists dream of: direct contact with an unknown culture, unmediated understanding of an alien perspective. Yet this was something far beyond human experience, something older and wider than our brief existence on this planet. I didn't complete the final step. Some last shred of self-preservation pulled me back from the brink. I staggered away from the circle as darkness fell, driving home in a state of dissociation so profound that I can't recall the journey. Now I sit in my study writing these words as the shadows gather in the corners. My academic mind is still trying to rationalize what's happening, suggesting psychological explanations, stress responses, hallucinations, but that voice grows weaker by the hour tonight. I know I will return to the circle in dreams. The watchers will be waiting closer than ever. They're patient. They've waited thousands of years. They can wait one more night, but I can feel their anticipation like a pressure behind my eyes. The spiral patterns have appeared on my skin, now faint whirls just below the surface. My neighbor reported seeing lights moving through my garden last night. The birds no longer fly away when I approach, they gather closer, their movements synchronized with my own. I understand now what the ritual truly does. It doesn't summon the watchers to our world. It transforms the practitioner into a vessel, a doorway through which they can perceive our reality more directly. The doctor's journal never mentioned what happens if the ritual is completed. Perhaps he never knew part of me. The professor, the skeptic. The human is terrified of losing myself entirely, but another part growing stronger every day is curious. What will I learn? What will I become? What knowledge waits beyond that threshold the sun is? Setting. Now I can feel the pull beginning. My consciousness already starting to drift toward the forest tonight. I think I will take the final step, not out of compulsion, but out of choice. The anthropologist's eternal pursuit of understanding taken to its ultimate conclusion, after all. Isn't this what I've spent my career searching for, the authentic experience of the other? The true meaning behind ancient rituals, the shadows in my study are moving again, forming familiar spiral patterns on the wall. Something is, whispering my name from everywhere and nowhere. I think I'll sleep now. The circle waits. The watchers wait, and I, whatever I am becoming, wait with them. The shadows in this house don't move the way they should. That was my first thought when I noticed the painting it hung there on the wall of my new country home depicting this very property. My property now in oils that shouldn't have retained such vibrant color after DEC aids of exposure. The house in the painting looked identical to the one I'd purchased, save for subtle differences I couldn't immediately place. Perhaps it was the angle of the roof or the way the windows seemed to reflect something that wasn't quite sky. I came here to write to escape the noise and distraction of Boston, where my apartment overlooked a street that never slept at 39, with 3 moderately successful novels behind me and a deadline looming. I needed isolation when my agent mentioned a client selling a remote property in western Massachusetts at a surprisingly reasonable price. I jumped at the opportunity the previous owner had left in a hurry. I was told pursuing some artistic opportunity overseas, most of the furniture remained, which explained the unusually low asking price. The painting wasn't mentioned in the listing. On my first night, I stood before it, glass of whiskey in hand, studying the brushwork. The technique was remarkable. Each blade of grass seemed to possess a unique shadow. Each cloud carried texture so realistic I could almost feel the dampness they promised the artist had captured the house from the perspective of someone standing at the edge of the surrounding woods, looking across the clearing where wildflowers now grew in chaotic patches. My house stood centered in the frame windows, dark except for one on the second floor where a faint yellow glow suggested occupancy. My new office window, I took another sip of whiskey, the alcohol warming my throat as I leaned closer to examine the signature, T. Marlowe, 1978. The name meant nothing to me. That first night passed uneventfully. I slept deeply, exhausted from the move and lulled by the profound quiet that only remote countryside can provide. The next morning, I established my writing routine, setting up my laptop in the upstairs office and losing myself in my work. The words flowed easily in this new environment. By evening, I had produced more pages than I typically managed in a week. It wasn't until my third day that I noticed the first change in the painting. I had developed a habit of pouring a nightcap and standing before the artwork, appreciating its craftsmanship before retiring that evening as I sipped my drink. Something about the painting struck me as different. The clouds, they weren't positioned as I remembered, where there had been a distinct formation resembling a hand reaching across the sky. Now there appeared to be only scattered wisps. I blinked, attributing the discrepancy to my fatigued mind and the whiskey's influence. Yet the nagging feeling persisted. Into the following day, during a break from writing, I descended to the living room specifically to examine the painting again in daylight. With a clear head, I could see that my memory hadn't been compromised. The clouds had indeed changed their configuration, and something else. The trees at the edge of the forest appeared to bend slightly as if caught in a breeze that hadn't been present in the original composition. My heartbeat quickened as I stepped closer. Art doesn't change, it's static by nature. I ran my fingers across the canvas, feeling only the expected texture of dried paint over fabric. No hidden mechanisms, no sophisticated trickery, just an ordinary painting that somehow wasn't ordinary at all. I attempted to rationalize the phenomenon. Perhaps the changing light throughout the day created optical illusions. Maybe the old house settled in ways that imperceptibly tilted the frame, altering how shadows fell across the painted surface. I even considered that my isolation was affecting my perception. Writers are notorious for their active imaginations. After all, the following day, I forced myself to avoid looking at the painting entirely. I worked upstairs, diligently breaking my own record for daily word count. When evening arrived, I prepared dinner and ate in the kitchen, then retreated directly to my bedroom with a book I would not indulge whatever psychological game my mind was playing. But at 2:17 a.m., I woke with my heart pounding against my ribs, sweat dampened. My shirt, despite the cool night air flowing through the open window, I had dreamed of standing in front of the painting, watching as the brushstrokes rearranged themselves before my eyes. In the dream, I couldn't look away as something began to take shape in one of the windows of the painted house. My house, I lay awake, telling myself to remain in bed, to close my eyes and return to sleep. Instead, I found myself padding barefoot down the creaking stairs drawn to the living room, as if pulled by an invisible thread. The house was dark, except for the pale moonlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the painting with an ethereal glow, and there it was. The change I had unconsciously anticipated in the upstairs window of the painted house where the yellow light glowed. A dark silhouette now stood, a human figure indistinct at this distance and scale, but unmistakably watching outward from the frame. Watching me, my mouth went dry. The hairs on my arms stood erect as a chill that had nothing to do with the night air swept over me. I reached for the wall switch with trembling fingers, flooding the room with harsh electric light that somehow made the painted figure appear more solid rather than dispelling it. I approached cautiously, my breath shallow and rapid. The figure remained stationary, a dark blot against the yellow window. It was small given the painting's dimensions, perhaps the size of my pinky fingernail, but its presence transformed the entire work. What had been a peaceful country scene now felt like a window into somewhere I shouldn't be looking. I spent the remainder of the night in a chair opposite the painting, watching it, waiting for movement that didn't come when dawn broke. I made coffee and searched online for information about Marlowe. The results were sparse but disturbing. Thomas Marlowe had been a promising regional artist who specialized in landscapes of western Massachusetts. In the late 1970s, he purchased a remote property, and became increasingly reclusive. His final exhibition featured exclusively paintings of his home, each depicting the structure from various angles and in different conditions. Art critics noted a progression in these works, with the later paintings containing subtle distortions and unsettling elements that departed from Marlowe's previously realistic style. Then I found the newspaper article from 1982 hidden in the digital archives of the local historical society. The headline was "Direct Local Artists Missing Unusual Circumstances." According to the piece, Marlowe had contacted a friend in a state of evident distress, claiming his latest work had become a passage rather than a painting. He reported that something was attempting to cross over from what he called the other side. The friend had dismissed these statements as artistic metaphor until Marlowe's disappearance 3 days later. Investigators found Marlowe's house, my house, immaculate and uninhabited. With a half-completed painting on his easel, the artist was never found. My hands shook as I closed my laptop. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps the painting was designed with some kind of slow-changing material that responded to temperature or humidity. Maybe Marlowe himself had created an elaborate hoax before disappearing to reinvent himself elsewhere. But that night, the figure had moved closer to the painted window. The following days became a blur of anxiety and fascination. I continued writing, producing pages. Filled with increasingly dark themes that diverged from my planned narrative, I couldn't stop myself from checking the painting multiple times daily, documenting each subtle change. The figure grew more distinct as it approached the window of the painted house. I could now make out the suggestion of a man's profile. Though the features remained indistinct, I considered removing the painting, but something prevented me from touching it. When I mentioned the artwork during a phone call with my agent describing it as unsettling, she had no recollection of any painting being included with the house. According to her records and the property inventory, the walls had been bare sleep, became fragmented and filled with dreams of standing before canvas portals. I developed a persistent sensation of being watched. Even when upstairs in my office with the door closed, the sound of brushstrokes sometimes reached my ears in the dead of night. Soft, wet sweeps against canvas when there was no possible source for such noises. A week after discovering the moving figure, I contacted the previous owner through my agent. His emailed response was brief and troubling. There was no painting when I left. I removed every trace of the original owner's presence. Whatever you're seeing, it returned on its own that night. I stared at the painting from across the room nursing my whiskey without tasting it. The figure now stood directly at the painted window, one hand pressed against the glass from the inside, though still. Rendered in the same oil paints as the rest of the scene, I could clearly discern a man's face gaunt with hollow eyes and an expression of desperate hunger. Not Thomas Marlowe as he appeared in photographs I'd found, but someone else, someone I'd never seen before, but who somehow felt familiar. The window in the painting had begun to distort around the pressure of the figure's hand bulging outward, as if the barrier between the artwork and reality had become flexible. My stomach clenched at the sight, bile rising in my throat. This defied everything I understood about the physical world, yet I couldn't deny what was happening before my eyes. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool evening as I retreated. The figure's head tilted slightly following my movement. Its other hand rose to join the first, both now pressing against the painted glass with visible force. The window bulged further, the oil somehow stretching beyond the flat plane. They should have been confined to that night. I barricaded myself in the upstairs bathroom, the only room without windows, and the furthest point from the painting. I sat on the floor with my back against the door. Laptop open before me as I frantically documented, mented everything I'd observed. If something happened to me, I wanted a record to exist. Sunrise found me exhausted but alive. I emerged cautiously, half expecting to find my home transformed or invaded. Instead, everything appeared normal until I entered the living room. The painting had changed dramatically. The figure was gone from the window, which no longer bulged. Instead, the front door of the painted house stood ajar just slightly, but unquestionably open when it had always been closed before. And on the painted path leading from the door toward the foreground of the canvas, a dark silhouette stood facing outward, waiting. I approached slowly, my entire body trembling. The figure had features now defined enough that I could see the curve of a smile, the hollow intensity of eyes that seemed to track my movement. It stood at the very edge of the painting's world, one foot seemingly positioned to step forward beyond the confines of the frame. As I watched, frozen in horror and fascination, I noticed something that stopped my breath entirely. Behind the figure, barely visible through the open door of the painted house, stood a second silhouette, smaller, less defined, but unmistakably there. And somehow I knew with a certainty that defied explanation that this second figure was watching me through the first, using it as a conduit, a means of perception, something that had been waiting a very long time for someone like me to notice the painting again. I packed a single bag that afternoon and checked into a motel 30 miles away. I called a real estate attorney from the stained bedspread, making arrangements to sell the property. Immediately, contents included when asked about my reason for selling. So soon after purchasing, I simply cited personal circumstances. The attorney seemed unsurprised. Properties in such remote locations often changed hands quickly. She noted that was 3 weeks ago. I've since returned to my apartment in Boston, where the constant noise of the city provides a strange comfort. My new novel remains unfinished, the manuscript abandoned in favor of this account yesterday. I received an email from the real estate attorney the house had sold. Already purchased sight unseen by an artist from New York seeking rural isolation to complete a series of works attached was a photo of the property listing in it. The living room wall is bare, the painting is gone, but last night, hanging a framed photograph in my bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Reflected in the glass of the frame was a familiar gaunt face with hollow eyes, just for an instant before disappearing. I've removed every frame, every mirror, every reflective surface from my apartment. I write this on a laptop with the screen dim to eliminate any possibility of reflection. But sometimes from the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of movement on blank walls, a brushstroke taking form the beginning of a familiar landscape, and I know that the painting isn't gone, it simply found a new canvas. The stars have always watched us. I never understood until now that some of them watch more intently than others. My name is Daniel Mercer. 3 weeks ago, I made what I thought was the purchase of a lifetime at the Harlow Scientific Estate auction, a pristine brass refracting telescope from 1873 crafted by the enigmatic Swedish astronomer Henrik Lindström. The auctioneer described it as a collector's item with unique optical properties, but at the time I was thrilled to acquire such a well-preserved antique for my collection. I've been an amateur astronomer since college, but at 37 I'd never owned anything so historically significant. The telescope itself is a marvel of 19th century craftsmanship, brass tubing with intricate engravings, mahogany tripod with brass fittings, and most curiously, a set of lenses arranged in a configuration I've never encountered in my years. Studying astronomical equipment when I first examined them, I noticed strange geometric patterns etched into the glass periphery of the main objective lens, triangular forms interconnected in a way that reminded me of circuit diagrams. I set it up in my home observatory, really just a converted shed in my backyard with a retractable roof ID installed last summer. The same night I brought it home, something about the telescope seemed to demand immediate use, as though it had waited long enough in storage after calibrating it as best I could. Some of the adjustment mechanisms differed from modern designs. I pointed it toward the eastern sky where Copa would be rising. What I saw changed everything at first. Everything appeared normal. The familiar W shape of Copa emerged as expected, but as I made minor adjustments to the focus, something shifted in the field of view. A cluster of stars that shouldn't have been there appeared just above the constation. 7 points of light arranged in a perfect heptagon glowing with a bluish tint, unlike the surrounding stars. I checked my star chart's digital planetarium app. Everything no known star cluster existed in that location. I watched for nearly an hour as the stars moved across the sky. The cluster moved too, but wrong. It maintained its rigid geometric formation while drifting at a pace slightly faster than the surrounding star field, as if it were closer than the stars behind it, yet still impossibly distant. My hands trembled as I made notes. Drew diagrams. I told myself it must be an optical anomaly in the antique lenses, or perhaps a high-altitude drone formation. The rational explanations felt hollow. Even as I wrote them down that night, I dreamt of an impossible sky, black but not empty, filled with geometric patterns of light that pulsed with intelligence. I floated in that void, neither falling nor rising, as the patterns seemed to arrange themselves around me. Studying me from all angles, I woke drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs on the bathroom mirror. I found a symbol drawn in condensation that hadn't been there when I'd gone to bed, a heptagon with lines connecting each point to its center, the same formation I'd seen in the sky. My stomach twisted as I wiped it away with my palm, feeling the cool moisture confirm it was real. I hadn't been sleepwalking since my teenage years, but what other explanation could there be? The second night, I returned to the telescope with a digital camera rigged to capture what I saw. The heptagon formation had returned, but now it appeared slightly larger in the viewfinder, as though it had indeed moved closer as I watched the points of life pulsed in sequence one, then the next, completing the circuit 3 times before returning to steady illumination. My mouth went dry. No natural phenomenon could explain this coordinated behavior. I triggered the camera, desperate to document what I was seeing when I reviewed the footage. Later, the screen showed only static where the formation should have been. Everything else, copy of the surrounding stars, appeared normal. Only the heptagon was missing that night. My dreams were more vivid. I stood on a barren plain under that same geometric sky, but now I could see what looked like structures on the horizon. Immense towers of impossible architecture spiraling up toward the patterns of light. A wind carried whispers in a language that seemed to twist inside my ears, almost comprehensible but slipping away before understanding could form. I woke to find my hands stained with ink, and on the walls of my bedroom row after row of symbols, curves and angles that hurt my eyes to follow, all arranged around a central heptagon. My pulse raced as I stumbled from room to room, finding more symbols scattered throughout the house, on windows mirrors, even across the screen of my laptop. I hadn't done this. I couldn't have done this. The symbols were too precise, too alien to anything I might create. Even in some somnambulistic state, I spent the morning researching Henrik Lindström, the telescope's creator. University archives and astronomical historical societies had little information. He'd been a minor figure in 19th century astronomy, noted primarily for his unorthodox theories about stellar communication, but in a digitized collection of letters from the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, I found correspondence describing Lindström's final years. According to his colleagues, he had become obsessed with a particular region of the sky near Kopa, claiming to have discovered what he called the Watcher's entities that existed between the stars and observed humanity. Through means beyond our comprehension, his final letter to the Academy, dated November 1874, stated that he had established contact and was preparing for their arrival. He disappeared the following week. His workshop found empty except for designs for the very telescope. Now in my possession, my throat constricted as I read the accounts. The hair on my arm stood on end. Despite the warmth of the room, I should have immediately destroyed the telescope, buried it, anything. But instead, I felt compelled to look again to confirm, to understand. The third night brought no clouds to obscure my view. The heptagon had grown dramatically larger, each point of light now clearly visible as a pulsing orb rather than a distant star. They rotated slowly around their center, which appeared as a void darker than the night sky itself. As I watched transfixed, the pattern began to emit beams of light that converged at a point that I calculated with growing horror to be directly above my house. My hands shook so violently I could barely maintain focus on the eyepiece. My breathing came in short, painful gasps. Something warm trickled from my nose. Blood, I realized, wiping it away with trembling fingers, yet I couldn't look away. A pressure built behind my eyes. As the lights pulsed faster, images flooded my mind. Vast cities of non-Idean architecture, beings of light and geometry moving through dimensions. I couldn't comprehend a network of observers spanning galaxies watching. Always watching, and through it all a sense of ancient attention finally deliberately returned. They had been watching us, watching me for longer than I could fathom. The telescope wasn't just an instrument for seeing, it was a beacon. A signal device crafted by Lindström to open a channel, and I had reactivated it. I tore myself away from the eyepiece, my legs buckling as I scrambled backward across the observatory floor. The symbols on the walls glowed with a faint luminescence, now pulsing in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. Through the open roof of the observatory, I could see the actual stars above, and there visible to the naked eye where nothing should be. 7 points of blue light arranged in perfect heptagonal formation. They were no longer visible, only through the telescope. I fled into the house, locking doors, pulling curtains. My mind raced through options. Destroy the telescope, contact someone, but who would believe this? My hands fumbled for my phone, but the screen displayed only a repeating pattern of the same alien symbols. Now covering my walls in the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm my ragged breathing and clear my thoughts. The face that stared back from the mirror was barely recognizable. Bloodshot eyes, skin pale and drawn dark circles, like bruises behind me reflected in the mirror. I saw the bathroom wall now covered in symbols that traced themselves as I watched, as if drawn by an invisible hand. I spent that night huddled in the corner of my living room, lights blazing, an old baseball bat across my knees, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was coming in. Brief moments of clarity, I wondered if I was experiencing a psychotic break, but then I'd see the symbols pulse with that alien light, or a glimpse through the window blinds the 7 points of blue fire. Now hanging low in the sky at dawn, a high-pitched tone began emanating from the direction of the observatory. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them entirely. Resonating directly in my skull, it modulated in patterns I began to recognize his language. The same curves and angles now covering every surface of my home, against all instinct for self-preservation. I found myself walking toward the observatory, drawn by a compulsion beyond my control. The telescope stood where I'd left it, but now the brass glowed with an internal light, the etched patterns on the lenses burning blue. The air around it shimmered with distortion. I understood then what had happened to Lindstrom. He hadn't disappeared, he had been taken, or perhaps had gone willingly to join the Watchers, and now they had returned for another observer with the last of my autonomous will. I grabbed the telescope, feeling it burn cold against my skin, and ran to my car. I drove for hours, putting as much distance as possible between myself and my home. In the trunk wrapped in blankets, the telescope occasionally emitted that same high-pitched tone, but fainter now, as if confused by the distance from where it had been activated. I've taken residence in this motel under a false name. Writing this account while I still can, the symbols have begun appearing here too. Slower, fewer, but unmistakable on the ceiling above the bed, through the window on clear nights. I can see them watching 7 points of blue light, smaller at this distance, but still arranged in their perfect heptagon. I've researched methods of destroying the telescope, but every time I approach it with that intent, my muscles seize and my vision blurs until I retreat. Whatever connection has been established works both ways. They found Lindstrom through his creation, and now they found me. Sometimes I wonder if they mean harm, or if their concept of interaction is simply so alien that what feels like terror, to me, is merely their attempt at communication. Perhaps Lindstrom understood this better than I do last night. I dreamed of him for the first time, an old man with wild eyes and a serene smile standing on that alien plane beneath the geometric sky. He held out his hand to me as the massive towers in the distance began to move, revealing themselves not as structures but as entities. Vast beyond comprehension, they only want an observer. He said in the dream, every lens looks both ways. I've sealed the telescope and a storage unit registered to a name that cannot be traced to me. I leave this account for whoever might find it. Should I disappear, as Lindstrom did, I feel the pull each night, the invitation to look up and see them watching, waiting for me to accept my role, and part of me, a growing part, wants to see what they have to show me. If you're reading this and you come across an antique brass telescope with strange patterns etched into its lenses, leave it where it lies. Some things in the universe observe us more closely than we could ever observe them, and once they've seen you through the right lens, they never look away. The stars have always watched us, but now I understand some of them have been waiting for us to watch back the first time I heard it. The sound didn't just fill the room, it penetrated my bones. A resonance so pure seemed to vibrate the very atoms of my being. That's when I should have known the violin wasn't just old, it was hungry, not for flesh or blood, but for something far more precious. Memory, emotion, the very essence of human experience. I realize now that every note I coaxed from those ancient strings was feeding something that should have remained dormant, buried in the forgotten corners of history. But by then it was already too late. The auction house was stuffy that afternoon, the air thick with dust, mows dancing in the sunbeams that streamed through tall windows. I hadn't planned on bidding on anything, merely accompanying my colleague Martin, who was looking for period furniture for his new apartment. Yet there it was. Lot number 137, a violin case, weathered and unassuming, tucked between ornate candelabras and Persian rugs. Something about it pulled at me after 50 years as a session musician and composer. I'd handled hundreds of instruments, but never had I felt such an immediate, visceral attraction. The auctioneer mentioned it was part of an estate sale. The previous owner, an elderly recluse, had no family to claim his possessions. When they opened the case for viewing the instrument inside, looked unremarkable. A violin of indeterminate age, its varnish darkened and cracked in places, the scrollwork detailed but worn smooth at the edges from centuries of handling. I raised my paddle almost involuntarily when bidding started at $3,200. It was a steal even for an instrument of uncertain provenance. Martin raised an eyebrow at me, mumbling that it wasn't like me to make impulse purchases. He was right, of course. In my 5 decades of professional musicianship, I'd always been methodical, practical. This was different. It felt like the violin had chosen me. The case was heavier than expected when I collected it out. After the auction, the attendant handed me a small envelope containing what little they knew of its history, supposedly crafted in northern Italy in the late 1700s, passing through several owners before landing with the recently deceased collector No-Maker. Mark was visible inside the body, though the craftsmanship suggested someone of considerable skill. That first night, I stayed up until dawn playing it. The tone was extraordinary, rich and complex, with harmonics that seemed to hang in the air long after the bow left the string. My fingers moved with unusual confidence across the neck, finding positions that felt oddly natural, despite the instrument's unfamiliar dimensions. By morning, my fingertips were raw, my shoulder aching, but my mind was electrified. I hadn't played with such abandon since my conservatory days. It was during that initial session that I first noticed something peculiar when I experimented with a melancholy etude in D minor. The table lamp beside me flickered not in the rhythmic pattern of a loose bulb, but in perfect synchronization with certain phrases. I dismissed it as coincidence. My old brownstone had wiring issues after all 3 nights. Later it happened again. This time I was working through a Bach Pardia when the wine glass on my side table began to vibrate, creating a subtle ringing that harmonized with the notes I was playing when I stopped it, ceased immediately when I resumed. So did the resonance. My rational mind searched for explanations, acoustic physics, sympathetic vibrations, but found each lacking. The dreams began a week later. In the first one, I found myself in a candlelit room I didn't recognize. The walls were covered with faded floral wallpaper, the furnishings ornate and antique. A man sat opposite me, dressed in clothing at least 2 centuries out of date, a high-collared shirt, waistcoat, and dark jacket. His face was gaunt but intense, with deep-set eyes that reflected the candlelight. He didn't speak, not with words. Instead, he raised a violin identical to mine and began to play. The composition was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Complex counterpoints woo through a melodic structure that seemed to defy conventional harmony, yet resolved with an emotional impact that left me breathless. I watched his fingers dance across the strings, committing each movement to memory. I woke with tears streaming down my face and the melody still resonant in my mind. Without hesitation, I reached for the violin beside my bed and began to play exactly what I'd heard in the dream. My fingers found the notes with perfect precision, as though I'd practiced the piece for years. When I finished, I scrambled for manuscript paper, desperate to capture it before it faded from memory. 3 hours later, I had transcribed the entire composition, some 27 pages of notation that should have been far beyond my capabilities. To recall, I showed the piece to Martin when he visited that weekend. He's a chist with the Philharmonic. Not easily impressed by amateur compositions, I didn't tell him about the dream, merely that I'd been experimenting with a new style as I played. I watched his face transform, at first curious, then intent, and finally strangely stricken when I finished. His eyes were redeemed, his breathing shallow. He asked me, voice unsteady, where I'd gotten the inspiration. Without waiting for my answer, he described feeling an overwhelming sense of longing for a homeland he'd never known, a place of mist. Covered mountains and ancient stone. Martin, who'd never left the East Coast except for concert tours, spoke of specific streets in a village he couldn't name, of the smell of peat fires and the sound of a language he'd never heard. I nearly told him then about the dream, but something held me back. Instead, I poured us both brandy and steered the conversation towards safer topics. Later, as he was leaving, he paused at the door and asked if he could have a copy of the score. I promised to send one, but never did. Something about his reaction troubled me deeply, as though I'd inadvertently exposed him to something harmful. The dreams continued 2 or 3 nights a week, always the same room, always the same man. Though sometimes the candles were positioned differently, or he wore slightly different clothing. He never spoke, only played, teaching me composition after composition each morning. After I would wake and transcribe what I'd learned, building a collection of works that grew increasingly complex and emotionally potent, I began to research obsessively, searching for any reference to the music or the man in my dreams. The style suggested late 18th century with innovative elements that peeraged the Romantic period. Yet I could find no record of compositions matching these characteristics from that transitional era. It was as if they'd been erased from musical history or had never existed at all around this time. Strange occurrences in my apartment became more frequent. Books would fall from shelves when I played certain passages. The temperature would drop suddenly in the room, sometimes dramatically enough to see my breath cloud before me twice. I distinctly heard what sounded like a man humming along with my playing. Though I was entirely alone, my sleeping patterns deteriorated. Even on nights without the musical dreams, my sleep was fragmented by vague nightmares of being watched, of whispered conversations. Just beyond my comprehension, I began to lose weight. My appetite diminished. Friends commented on my pallor, my distracted demeanor. I brushed off their concerns, becoming increasingly reclusive as my obsession with the violin and its mysterious music intensified. I arranged a small recital at a local gallery featuring several of the dream compositions. I invited a select audience, colleagues, former students, a music critic I'd known for years. The performance space was intimate, just 30 seats arranged in a semicircle. As I played the first piece, I observed the audience closely. It began subtly. A woman in the front row dabbing at her eyes, a man clutching the armrests of his chair with whitened knuckles. By the third composition, the effect was unmistakable. The entire audience seemed transported. Their faces slack with emotion, several were openly weeping. One man near the back began to mutter in what sounded like Italian, a language he later confirmed he'd never studied. The critic, normally impassive, appeared physically ill, sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the room's chill after the performance, several attendees approached me with disturbing accounts of what they'd experienced. One described vivid memories of a lover's quarrel in a stone-paved courtyard, though she'd never been to Europe. Another spoke of overwhelming grief for a brother lost at sea, though he was an only child. Each described these false memories with absolute conviction, as though the experiences were more real than their actual lives. I cannelled the remaining performances I'd planned that night, sitting alone with the violin across my lap. I finally admitted to myself that something was profoundly wrong. The instrument rested in my hands, its wood gleaming with an inner light that seemed impossible. I ran my fingers across its surface, feeling irregularities in the varnish that formed patterns like text in an alphabet I couldn't read. In my desperation for answers, I decided to do what I should have done. Weeks earlier, examined the instrument thoroughly. I carefully removed the strings, then used a small dental mirror to inspect the interior. There, just visible through the F-hole, was a small inscription I hadn't noticed before. Not a maker's mark, but what appeared to be a date and initials. 1788 GD. The sight of those markings sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. 1788, the height of the musical period reflected in my dream composition in GD. Could it be the gaunt man who visited my dreams? My hands trembled as I restrung the violin that night. I waited for sleep with equal parts dread and anticipation, desperate for answers, yet terrified of what I might learn. The dream came as expected, but with a crucial difference. This time, when the man finished playing, he looked directly at me and spoke. His voice was accented, each word precisely articulated, as though he wasn't accustomed to speaking English. "You play well," he said, better than the others. My throat constricted with fear, but I forced myself to respond. I asked who he was, what he wanted from me. His thin lips curled into something approximating a smile. Though it never reached his eyes, he explained in fragmented sentences that he had been Jeppe Delori, a composer whose works had been systematically destroyed by a rival after his death. His music, his legacy had been erased from history, his genius forgotten. Only the violin remained, containing within its wood the memories of his compositions. Each new player became a vessel for his music, a chance to resurrect what had been lost. What he said next made my blood run cold. The violin didn't just preserve his music, it preserved fragments of the experiences, emotions, and memories of everyone who had ever played it or heard its music. Each performance extracted something essential from listeners, storing these emotional essences within the instrument itself. These accumulated experiences were what gave the violin its extraordinary sound, its unnatural power. I asked, voice barely audible, even to my own ears. What happened to the previous owners? His expression darkened, and he merely gestured around the room. His room, I now understood, where he had composed and eventually died. He was showing me my future if I continued. Eternal intimate in this liminal space, neither fully living nor completely dead-bound to the instrument that had consumed me, I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat. The violin lay next to me on the bed, though I distinctly remembered placing it in its case before sleeping. My fingers ached as though I'd been playing for hours next to the bed. Impossibly lay sheets of music notation in my own handwriting compositions. I had no memory of transcribing in the gray light of dawn. I made my decision I couldn't destroy the violin, something that ancient and powerful wouldn't be so easily eliminated, and I couldn't bear the thought of its music being lost forever. Yet I couldn't keep it knowing what it was doing to me. And to those who heard it played that afternoon, I carefully packed the violin and drove to the countryside where my mentor, now in his 90s, lived in semi-retirement. Professor Ambrose had studied musicology and restoration techniques in Vienna. If anyone could understand the instrument's history and significance, it would be him. More importantly, he possessed the wisdom to know what should be done with such an artifact. I explained everything, the dreams, the compositions, the effect on listeners, and the vision of Jeppe Delori. I expected skepticism, perhaps even concern for my mental health. Instead, the old man listened intently, his rheumy eyes focused on the violin case, as though he could see through the leather to the instrument within. When I finished, he nodded slowly and asked if IID played any of the compositions for him. I hadn't, and he seemed relieved. He explained that he'd encountered references to Delori in obscure musicological texts, a promising composer who died young in 1788. His works supposedly lie destroyed in a fire. There were rumors never substantiated of instruments that could absorb and transmit human experience. Their very wood becoming saturated with emotional residue over centuries of use. The professor believed the violin shouldn't be destroyed but shouldn't be played. Either, he suggested, a solution: the instrument would be sealed in a lead-lined case and donated anonymously to a prestigious musical archive with specific instructions that it never be played. Or loaned out. Its historical significance would ensure its preservation. The precautions would prevent its power from affecting others. As I prepared to leave the violin with him, a wave of loss crashed over me, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My fingers literally ached with the need to play it. One last time, the compulsion was physical, overwhelming. Bringing me to my knees on the professor's worn carpet, he watched with compassionate understanding, telling me gently that this reaction confirmed everything the violin had forged a connection with me that was breaking as we separated it. Took every ounce of willpower to leave without the instrument. As I drove home, I felt simultaneously hollowed out and liberated, as though something had been extracted from me but had taken a malignant growth. Along with it, that was 6 months ago, the compositions remain. I've kept the scores locked in a safe deposit box, unsure whether they should ever be performed. Sometimes I dream of music. Still, but it's ordinary music now, without the transcendent quality of Doré's work. My own compositions have taken on a different character, more introspective, less technically brilliant, but wholly mine. Yet sometimes in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear at the perfect resonance of that violin playing a melody that calls to me across centuries. And in those moments, I'm never entirely certain whether I'm remembering what was or receiving a summons to what still awaits me. pages knew my name before I knew theirs. That's the thought that keeps circling in my mind as I wander through another identical corridor lined with the ancient bookshelves that shouldn't exist. The air here hangs stale and heavy, thick with the scent of aged leather, yellowed paper, and something else. Something darker that clings to the back of my throat with each labored breath. The weak light from my phone barely penetrates the darkness, casting grotesque shadows that seem to reach toward me from between the endless rows of books. I've been in this building for hours now. Or is it days? My watch stopped at 3:17 p.m., the exact moment I first opened that damn manuscript. I should have walked away. Any rational person would have. But I'm Dr. Richard Harlow, respected literary researcher with a reputation for unearthing forgotten texts. When the demolition notice went up on the old Blackwood building downtown 3 weeks ago, I couldn't resist one final exploration before the wrecking balls erased another piece of our city's history. The building had been abandoned for decades, a crumbling Victorian-era relic with boarded windows and a facade stained black from a century of industrial pollution. The demolition company's foreman barely glanced at my university credentials before waving me through. Just don't get yourself killed in there. Professor Building comes down Friday, whether you're in it or not. That was my first mistake. My second was ignoring the unnaturally cold draft that guided me to the hidden door behind a rusted radiator in the building's east wing basement. My third, the one I replay constantly now, was touching the first book. The hidden library shouldn't have existed. The room appeared on no blueprint, no historical record of the building. A perfect circular chamber with a dome ceiling ringed by mahogany shelves that stretched upward for at least 2 stories. At the center stood a circular reading table with a single chair illuminated by a shaft of sunlight from a stained glass. Oculus that I knew couldn't possibly align with the actual structure of the building. Above the collection was immaculate hundreds, perhaps thousands of volumes, with leather bindings in perfect condition. Despite the decay that pervaded the rest of the structure, my heart raced at the discovery. A tingle crept up my spine, that familiar academic excitement of finding something extraordinary, something that would secure my legacy in the field. As I approached the nearest shelf, my fingertips throbbed with anticipation. The titles were embossed in faded gold lettering in languages I recognized and others I didn't. Some appeared to be ancient manuscripts, others more modern. Cesses, no dust, not a single cobweb, just row after row of pristine books in a sealed room that had seemingly escaped the ravages of time. I selected a slim volume bound in burgundy leather, no title on the spine. As I pulled it from the shelf, a whisper seemed to emanate from the stacks behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. Just my imagination, I told myself. Amplified by the unusual acoustics of the circular room, yet my mouth went dry and I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. The book opened with surprising ease, the binding supple, as if recently oiled. The text was handwritten in an elegant script, the language archaic but recognizable English. I began to read an account of a 17th century merchant's voyage to India. Fascinating, but nothing extraordinary. I returned the book to its place and selected another. That's when I first noticed it as I slid the burgundy volume back into place. The gold lettering on its spine had changed where there had been no title before. Now gleamed the words, "The Voyage of Richard Harlow." My own name. A cold sweat broke across my forehead. I yanked the book back out and opened it again. The text remained unchanged. Still the merchant's account, nothing about me. I must have misread the spine in the dim light. I returned the book and deliberately turned my attention elsewhere, selecting a larger tome from a higher shelf. Hours passed as I examined volume after volume. Each contained rare texts that would be invaluable to literary scholars. Lost plays, unknown poems, forgotten histories. I began taking notes on my phone, cataloging my finds. My fingers trembled with excitement, already composing the paper I would write about this discovery. The library would make my career. I had to document everything before the demolition. It was when I glanced back at the burgundy book that I felt the first genuine chill of fear from across the room. I could clearly see that its spine now bore a different title entirely. I approached slowly, My footsteps, unnaturally loud on the marble floor, the new title read The Discovery of the Blackwood Archive. With shaking hands, I pulled it from the shelf and opened it. The text had changed completely now. It described in meticulous Euless detail my discovery of the hidden door behind the radiator. Earlier that day, the exact words I had muttered to myself when I felt the cold draft, the precise number of steps I had taken down the narrow staircase. Even the coffee stain on my left cuff was noted with dispassionate accuracy. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. I snapped the book shut, my heart hammering against my ribs when I opened it again. The text remained the same, a perfect recounting of my actions leading to the discovery of the library. I dropped the book as if it had burned me. It hit the floor with a dull thud that echoed unnaturally long in the circular room. I needed air. The atmosphere in the chamber had grown oppressive, the silence too complete. I gathered my phone and notebook and headed for the narrow staircase that had led me down. As I reached the threshold, an overwhelming compulsion made me turn back. The burgundy book no longer lay on the floor where I had dropped it. Instead, it sat open on the central reading table, pages riffling as if caught in a breeze. Though the air was completely still against all better judgment, I approached the table. The pages settled as I drew near. Open to a new section I hadn't seen before, the text now described my current movements. My fear, the cold sweat beating on my upper lip. The final line on the visible page read, "Despite his growing apprehension, Dr. Harlow could not resist turning to the next page." My fingers moved of their own accord. Turning the page, the new text described events that hadn't yet happened. My decision to take several books from the archive. My attempt to leave the building, my growing panic as I realized I couldn't find the exit. I slammed the book closed, my breathing ragged and shallow. This was some elaborate prank, it had to be. Perhaps a colleague had discovered the room before me and was playing a malicious joke. I gathered several of the most valuable-looking volumes, including the burgundy book, and shoved them into my messenger bag. I would examine them somewhere else, somewhere normal under proper lighting with proper air that didn't feel like it was seeping into my lungs. With malevolent intent, the staircase that had led me down to the library now seemed steeper, the steps narrower. I ascended quickly, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere below at the top, instead of the basement room with the rusted radiator. I found myself in a corridor lined with bookshelves identical to those in the circular chamber. My stomach dropped. I must have taken a wrong turn, emerged through a different door. I retraced my steps, descended the staircase again, only to find myself in yet another corridor of books. No circular chamber, no exit, just endless stacks that all looked the same, illuminated by that same quality of light that seemed to have no source. My phone's flashlight flickered and died. The battery suddenly drained. Hours passed as I wandered through the labyrinthine stacks. Each corridor led to another identical in every way. Occasionally I would glimpse movement at the periphery of my vision, a shadow sliding between shelves, the brief impression of fingers withdrawing a book. But whenever I turned to look directly, nothing was there. The physical symptoms of my fear became impossible to ignore. My shirt clung to my back, soaked with cold sweat. My mouth felt packed with cotton, my throat constricting with each attempt to call for help. My legs trembled with exhaustion and terror, yet I forced myself to keep moving, certain that the exit must be just around the next corner. Eventually, I stumbled back into the circular chamber, the central. Reading table now held a different book, larger. Bound in black leather with silver clasps, as I approached, I saw my name in boss on the cover in silver lettering. The complete works of Richard Harlow. My rational mind screamed at me to turn away, to continue searching for an exit, but my body moved forward as if pulled by an invisible force. I stood before the table, staring down at the book that shouldn't exist with trembling hands. I unfastened the silver clasps. The first pages contained my published academic works exactly as I had written them. Word for word, then came my unpublished manuscript scripts, private journal entries, letters I had written but never sent. As I turned the pages, the content shifted to thoughts I had never committed to, paper secrets I had never shared with anyone, The book knew things about me that I had scarcely acknowledged to myself. My breath came in short, painful gasps as I turned to the final section. Here were blank pages, dozens of them waiting to be filled. Only the first blank page contained a single line of text. Dr. Haar closed the book and finally understood. I slammed the volume shut. My entire body shaking, the realization crashed over me like a wave of ice water. This wasn't a library, it was something else, something that had been waiting for me. I grabbed the black book and shoved it into my bag alongside the others. If I couldn't find an exit, I would make one. I rushed to the wall of the circular chamber and began pulling books from the shelves, looking for a hidden mechanism, a concealed door. Anything books tumbled to the floor, their pages fluttering open from each. Whispers emerged, countless voices speaking in languages both familiar and alien, their unintelligible murmurs rising to fill the chamber with a cacophony of sound in desperation. I pulled a fire emergency axe from its case on the wall, a case I was certain hadn't been there moments before I swung the axe at the wall between two bookshelves. The blade connected with a dull thud sinking into the surface, not with the crack of splintering wood or crumbling plaster, but with the wet yielding resistance of something organic. I yanked the axe free and dark fluid seeped from the wound in the wall, viscous and warm. I stumbled backward, dropping the axe with a clatter. The whispers from the fallen books grew louder, more insistent. The fluid from the wall began to pool on the floor, flowing in rib vie toward the central table as it reached the table. Legs, the black book I had left there, began to pulse with a faint rhythmic glow like a heartbeat. Understanding crashed over me. In waves of nauseating clarity, the library wasn't in the building. The library was the building, or perhaps more accurately, the building was merely the physical manifestation of something far older, far vaster than the structure itself, something that collected stories, experience, expenses, lives. My legs gave way and I collapsed into the chair at the reading table. The black book lay before me, pulsing in sync with my own racing heart, with a resignation born of exhaustion and terror. I opened it again to the last written page. The single line had changed. Dr. Harrow understood that he had not discovered the archive. The Arab had discovered him. I turned to the next page, no longer blank. Now it read, he realized that he had a choice. My gaze lifted from the page to survey the circular room. The books I had pulled from the shelves were back in place, the walls intact with no sign of my axe attack. The oppressive atmosphere remained, but somehow it felt less malevolent. Now more expectant, I returned to the book where more text had appeared. The Blackwood Archive had existed for centuries, collecting and preserving stories that would otherwise be lost. It needed a new caretaker, someone who would appreciate its contents, maintain its collection in return. It offered knowledge. Beyond imagining, the implication was clear. I could become the new librarian, the guardian of this impossible collection. Or I could continue my futile attempt to escape wandering the endless corridors until exhaustion and dehydration claim me. Is it still a choice when there is only one viable option? I closed the book and placed my palm flat on its cover. I accept, I whispered to the empty room. My voice hoarse from hours of panicked breathing. The change was immediate. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the light from the oculus brightened. Illuminating the chamber fully for the first time, a door appeared in the wall directly across from me. A door I knew led to my office at the university, though that should have been physically impossible. As I rose from the chair, the black book vanished, only to reappear on a previously empty shelf near the newly manifested door. I approached it, noting that its title had changed again. Now it read The Custodian's Guide. I understand now the archive will not release me. Not completely, but neither will it trap me. I can move between my old life and this new realm, collecting stories, preserving knowledge during the day I am still. Dr. Richard Harlow, respected literary researcher at night, I returned to the archive through the door that now exists in the back of my office closet. The building was never demolished. The construction company mysteriously lost the paperwork, and the city council suddenly discovered the structure's historical significance. No one questions why I spend so much time there. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Then I open another volume and lose myself in impossible knowledge, and the question seems irrelevant. The pages know my name, and now I know theirs. When you find this account, and you will, if the archive wishes it, know that it has chosen you as it chose me. The book you hold has already changed since you began reading. Look at its cover, see your name there. The archive has found its next custodian. Welcome to the collection. The asphalt stretched before me like a black river cutting through the dense forest, its edges crumbling just enough to make me question its maintenance schedule. My truck's headlights carve twin tunnels through the growing darkness, illuminating nothing but more road and the occasional reflective marker. I've been driving for 18 years, and never had I felt such immediate, inexplicable dread on a simple detour. The air inside my cab had grown thick, almost resistant to my lungs, as if warning me with each labored breath, turn back, turn back, turn back. Route 16 was backed up for miles. According to the CB chatter, some chemical spill had shut down both lanes, and dispatch was breathing down my neck about the delivery schedule I had. 40,000 pounds of refrigerated goods that needed to make it to Tulsa by morning, and sitting in traffic for 4 hours wasn't an option. My GPS showed nothing but the main highway and county roads that looped so far out of the way they'd add another 5 hours to my trip. That's when I spotted it, a well-paved side road cutting through the forest that didn't appear on any of my maps. The asphalt looked fresh enough, and the width seemed more than adequate for my rig. A quick glance at my watch made the decision for me. I signaled, though there was no traffic behind me to care, and guided my 18-wheeler onto the unmarked road. The first 10 minutes seemed to confirm I'd made the right choice. The pavement was smooth, the curves gentle enough for my rig, and the decline in elevation meant I was saving fuel. I even allowed myself a satisfied smile, imagining how I'd tell the other drivers about this shortcut at the next truck stop. It was the sudden absence that I noticed first, the complete lack of other vehicles. No headlights in my mirrors, none approaching from the opposite direction on a front Friday evening. Even a back road should have some traffic. I checked my phone. No signal. My GPS screen displayed nothing but a blue arrow floating in digital emptiness. That's when the landscape began to shift. The changes were subtle at first. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider. With species I didn't recognize from this region, the guardrails. When present appeared outdated designs I remembered from childhood road trips with my father in the 70s. The few road signs I passed were weathered beyond their years, their reflective coating dulled to near uselessness, displaying speed limits in an older typographic style that had been phased out decades ago. I switched on the radio, hoping for a weather report or some traffic updates. Static hissed from the speakers as I turned the dial through dead air, until suddenly the cabin filled with the unmistakable opening notes of Earth Angel by the Penguins. The song finished, and a deep, smooth voice faded in over the final notes. That was the Penguins with Earth Angel climbing the charts this week in 1954. Stay tuned for more of the greatest hits on KXL, your music authority. And don't forget to visit Johnson's Drive-In this Saturday for the grand opening celebration, free popcorn for the kids, and a special appearance by local baseball hero Tommy Williams before he heads off to spring training with the Brooklyn Dodgers. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. The Dodgers hadn't been in Brooklyn since 1957. I jabbed at the radio preset buttons, but each one now played only variations of the same station swing music. Do early rock and roll. Every announcer spoke as if it were the mid-1950s, promoting events long past and products long discontinued. The truck's thermometer showed 72 degrees, but a chill raised goosebumps along my arms. Sweat beaded on my forehead, trickling down my temples. Despite the cold that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep inside me, my breathing quickened, each exhale visible as a small cloud in the supposedly warm cab. I decided to turn around. This shortcut was clearly taking me too far off course, and something about it felt increasingly wrong. I slowed the rig, looking for a suitable turnout or intersection. The road stretched empty before and behind me, curving gently through densely wooded hills. After another mile, I spotted a wide shoulder and carefully maneuvered my truck around, facing back the way I'd come. I accelerated, expecting to retrace my path to the highway, But after 15 minutes of driving, I'd encountered no intersection, no familiar landmarks from my inbound journey. The forest pressed closer to the roadside, the trees now massive primeval things with gnarled branches that seemed to reach toward the road. My headlights caught the reflective eyes of something watching from between the trunks, something too tall to be a deer. The muscles in my jaw ached from clenching my teeth. My mouth had gone desert dry, despite the bottle of water I kept draining. The road should have returned me to the highway by now. I checked my odometer. I'd driven further on the return journey than the entire distance I'd traveled on this road in the first place. The radio continued its unsettling broadcast, now playing a news update about the Suez Crisis and Soviet troops in Hungary. The announcer's voice occasionally distorted, stretching and compressing like a tape player with dying batteries between songs. I could now hear something else beneath the announcer's voice. Whispers too faint to make out, but clearly there. A chorus of hushed voices murmuring behind the broadcast. I shut off the radio, but the whispering continued. It took me several terrifying seconds to realize it was coming from my CB radio, which I had not turned on. I reached for it with a shaking hand and picked up the handset. "Come back to us, been waiting so long, your place is ready." "We saved your seat." The voices were numerous, overlapping, speaking in unison, and yet somehow out of sync. I slammed the handset back into its cradle and yanked the power cord from the unit. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. My headlights seemed to be dimming their beams, penetrating less and less of the darkness ahead. I flipped on my high beams and fog lights, but the added illumination made little difference. The darkness had a thickness to it, a substance that swallowed light. The road before me changed. The relatively new asphalt gave way to an older concrete surface divided by tar-filled expansion joints that created a rhythmic thump-thump under my tires. These older highways had been largely replaced in the 1960s. I checked my side mirrors, hoping to see the lights of another vehicle, any sign of the present day, but there was only darkness. My truck's engine note changed, dropping to a lower-labored growl. Despite my foot maintaining the same pressure on the accelerator, the speedometer needle dropped from 55 to 40, then 35. The engine straining against some invisible resistance. Warning lights flashed on my dashboard. Oil pressure battery check engine. Though the truck was barely a year old and had been serviced the previous week, the air grew colder still, my breath now clouded heavily with each exhale, and frost patterns began forming at the edges of my windshield. The defroster strained uselessly against the creeping ice. My fingers felt stiff joints aching as I gripped the wheel. That's when I saw them, the lights ahead. Not headlights, but the warm yellow glow of street lamps. Illuminating what appeared to be a small town nestled among the trees. Relief washed through me so powerful I felt lightheaded civilization. People help as I approached the details resolve themselves through the darkness. It was indeed a town, or at least a main street with buildings that wouldn't have looked out of place in a documentary about 1950s. America, a movie theater with a triangular marquee, a drugstore with a soda fountain visible through large windows, a service station with gleaming pumps and rounded edges that had gone out of style decades ago, and there were people. Silhouettes moving along the sidewalks, entering and exiting the buildings, but something was wrong with their movements. They seemed to stutter like frames missing from a film reel, appearing in one spot and then another without the intervening motion, and they cast no shadows, despite the streetlights shining directly on them. I slowed the truck as I entered the town limits ass sign, welcoming me to Millerville, population 1,157. The name meant nothing to me. I'd driven this region for years and had never heard of such a place. The buildings all showed signs of life. Lights on open signs displayed yet an overwhelming stillness permeated the scene. No leaves moved on the trees that lined the street. No flags or awnings stirred in what should have been at least a slight breeze. The silhouette people continued their jerky, impossible movements, and as I drew closer, I realized they had no faces, just smooth, featureless ovals where distinct human features should be. My heart hammered against my ribcage like it was trying to escape each pulse. Echoed in my ears, my temporal arteries throbbing visibly at the edges of my vision. I fought the urge to floor the accelerator and blast through the town. Something told me that drawing attention to myself would be the worst possible mistake I maintained. A steady pace hand slick with sweat on the steering wheel as I passed the service station. All the faceless figures stopped their motion simultaneously as when they turned toward my truck. Though they had no eyes, I felt thousands of gazes fixing on me. The pressure of their attention made it difficult to breathe, as if the air itself had become dense and resistant. The truck's radio switched itself on the volume, rising to a painful level. It was no longer playing music, but broadcasting a single voice, male formal, like a news announcer from old television broadcasts. Attention, we have a deviation subject vehicle not scheduled for transition until November. 2026, chronological displacement. Unauthorized retrieval protocol initiated. The faceless figures began moving toward the street, their movements now smooth, purposeful. Some pointed at my truck. Others seemed to be communicating, their featureless heads tilting toward one another. Though no mouths moved, no sounds emerged. I reached the center of town where the main street intersected with another road. The traffic light suspended above the intersection glowed red in all four directions, simultaneously an impossible configuration. The faceless figures had reached the edges of the street, now forming a slowly constricting perimeter around my truck. The truck's engine coughed and died. The dashboard went dark. The headlights extinguished. I turned the key frantically, but the engine didn't even attempt to turn over. Not even a click from the starter. The only light now came from the street lamps and the still blaring radio, which illuminated the cab with an unnatural blue-white glow. Retrieval units dispatched. The radio voice continued. Temporary holding pattern. Established subject will be processed according to protocol. 7:39. The faceless people began to move into the street, forming a slowly tightening circle around my now dead truck. My breathing came in short, painful gasps. Spots danced at the edges of my vision. The inside of the cab had grown cold enough that my hands were losing sensation. The advancing figures were now close enough that I could see they weren't simply faceless. Their skin had the texture and sheen of old photograph paper, yellowed and slightly glossy in desperation. I grabbed my emergency flashlight from the glove compartment and switched it on. Its beam was unnaturally bright, cutting through the darkness with such intensity that the approaching figures recoiled, their paper-skin hands raised as if to shield non-existent eyes. The radio voice distorted, breaking up warning light spectrum, inconsistent with temporal parameters, potential breach. I swept the flashlight beam in an arc around the truck, creating a momentary perimeter that the figures seemed unwilling to cross. The beam fell upon the traffic light, still impossibly red in all directions. When the light touched it, the signal sputtered and cycled rapidly through its colors before settling on a normal pattern. Red for the cross street, green for the road ahead of me. In that instant, I felt a shift. The air pressure changed. My ears popping painfully. The cold began to recede. The faceless figures retreated their movements. Once again becoming jerky and discontinuous, the radio sputtered back to normal programming. A late-night talk show discussing current events. My truck's engine turned over without my touching the key. The dashboard lighting up with its familiar configuration, the headlights blazed back to life. Illuminating an empty street, the town was still there, but the buildings now appeared weathered, many with boarded windows and faded signs. The movie theater marquee was blank, its triangular sign missing letters. The drugstore windows were empty. Dusty, I drove forward, passing through the abandoned town. My flashlight still gripped tightly in one hand. The road beyond returned to modern asphalt, and within minutes I saw green reflective signs for the interstate. My GPS flickered back to life, showing my position just a few miles from where I'd made my ill-advised detour as I merged onto the highway, surrounded by the comforting sight of other vehicles. My phone buzzed with a backlog of messages from dispatch asking about my location and status. The clock on my dashboard showed I'd lost nearly 3 hours. I never reported what happened. What could I say, but sometimes when I'm driving late at night and pass a small town exit, I catch a glimpse of old-style street lamps in my side mirror, and occasionally my radio briefly picks up a station playing songs from the 1950s. The announcer's voice partially obscured by what sounds like many people whispering my name. I've requested a different route from my dispatcher. I told them the mountain passes make me nervous. The truth is, I've checked historical maps of the region, and there's a notation about a town called Millerville that was abandoned in the 1960s when the new interstate bypassed it completely. The last census recording its population was in 1957, the count 158. The ticking began to feel like a hammer against my skull on the third night. Not constant, but irregular, sometimes hurried, sometimes languid, as if the clock were breathing. The mahogany grandfather clock stood nearly 7 feet tall in my study, its brass pendulum swinging with hypnotic precision. Except when it didn't, that was when the trouble began. That was when I first suspected I wasn't alone in my house anymore. My name is Michael Lawson, and until 3 weeks ago, I was a respected corporate attorney with a reputation for rational thinking and meticulous attention to detail. These qualities made me excellent at my job, but utterly unprepared for what would happen. After I inherited my great-uncle Howard's estate, among the various antiques and heirlooms was an ornate grandfather clock that had been in our family for generations. It arrived with a sealed envelope containing a handwritten note from my great-uncle. The Lawson clock must never stop ticking. Keep it wound at all times, never place it in a bedroom or any room where people sleep. These are not suggestions, Michael. Your safety depends on it. I remember laughing when I read it. Howard had always been eccentric, filled with superstitions and strange habits. In my line of work, I dealt with facts and evidence, not folklore and ghost stories. So I placed the magnificent timepiece in the corner of my bedroom where its rich chimes could lull me to sleep each night for the first few days. Everything was normal. The clock kept perfect time, chiming on the hour with a deep, resonant tone that I found oddly comforting. I wound it diligently each morning, admiring the craftsmanship of its gleaming brass mechanisms and intricately carved wooden case. On the fifth day, I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. Without any apparent reason, the room felt unusually cold, and I noticed immediately that the familiar ticking had stopped. The silence was deafening, half asleep. I fumbled with my phone's flashlight and checked the clock it had stopped at 11:45 p.m. Despite being fully wound, I reset the time and got the pendulum swinging again, chalking it up to the clock's age. Perhaps it needed servicing after all these years. The next night, the same thing happened again. The clock stopped at precisely 11:45 p.m. This time, however, something else occurred. As I stood in the darkness staring at the silent timepiece, I heard what sounded like a long, ragged breath coming from somewhere in the house. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I convinced myself it was just the old house settling, or perhaps the wind outside. I reset the clock again and returned to bed, pulling the cover tightly around me. Despite the unusually warm night, on the seventh night I decided to stay awake until midnight. Watching the clock, I sat in my reading chair facing the timepiece, a glass of bourbon in my hand at exactly 11:45 p.m. Without any warning or mechanical hesitation, the pendulum simply stopped mid-swing. The ticking ceased, and in that moment of sudden silence, I distinctly heard heavy breathing from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sat. Frozen in my chair, the breathing was unmistakable now. Not my imagination, not the house settling, but the slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation of something just beyond my door, something waiting. I couldn't move. My muscles had turned to stone as my eyes remained fixed on the shadowy space beneath my door. There in the sliver of darkness, I saw movement, a deeper shadow passing back and forth as if something were pacing in my hallway. The breathing grew louder, more labored, more hungry. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I summoned the courage to stand. My legs trembled as I approached the clock with shaking hands and restarted the pendulum the moment the ticking resumed. The breathing stopped, the shadow beneath my door vanished. I spent the remainder of that night with all the lights on. Researching the history of my great-uncle's clock the following days became a blur of exhaustion and growing dread. I moved the clock to my study as Howard had instructed, hoping this would solve the problem. It didn't. Each night precisely at 11:45 p.m., the clock would stop. Despite being wound each night, the breathing would return, growing more audible, more present each night. The shadows on my walls seemed to twist and stretch into impossible shapes, always treating the moment I restarted the clock. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Dark circles formed under my bloodshot eyes. My colleagues at the law firm commented on my appearance, suggesting I take some time off. Perhaps they were right. I needed answers more than I needed rest. I took a week's leave and dove into research. I visited the local historical society, where I discovered that the clock had been crafted in 1887 by a Swiss immigrant named Adrian Keller, who had settled in our town after fleeing his homeland under mysterious circumstances. According to the records, Keller was not merely a clockmaker, but dabbled in what the historical accounts delicately referred to as esoteric practices. The librarian noticed my interest and mentioned that her grandmother had told stories about Keller with evident discomfort. She explained that local legend held that Keller had lost his wife to a mysterious illness, after which he'd become obsessed with the concept of trapping spirits. There were whispers that he had found a way to bind something, not his wife's spirit, but something else, something he'd encountered during his desperate attempts to breach the veil. Between worlds, that night I examined the clock more carefully than before. Behind the clock face, I discovered tiny inscriptions, symbols I didn't recognize, etched into the brass gears. They didn't appear to serve any mechanical purpose as I traced them with my fingertip. The room seemed to grow colder around me. My breath clouded in the suddenly frigid air. The clock stopped at 11:45 p.m., as it had every night before. This time I was prepared. I had set up a digital recorder in the hallway and another in my bedroom as the ticking ceased. The familiar heavy breathing began, but it seemed closer now, more substantial. The shadows on my study wall began to move, stretching and swirling like smoke into a vaguely humanoid shape. My heart pounded so violently I feared it might burst from my chest. Sweat drenched my shirt. Despite the unnatural cold, the shadow continued to grow, extending across the wall and onto the ceiling. The breathing had become a ragged, wet sound, the desperate gasps of something that had been drowning for a very long time. I couldn't restart the clock. My body refused to move toward the horrifying silhouette that now dominated my study. Instead, I fled, slamming the door behind me and racing to my car. I spent that night in a hotel, the first decent sleep I'd had in weeks. The next morning, I returned home to retrieve the digital recorders. The one in the hallway contained nothing unusual, just the ambient sounds of an empty house. The one in my study, however, made my blood freeze in my veins. After the sound of the door slamming and my footsteps retreating, there was a moment of silence. Then a voice grasping ancient speaking in a language I didn't understand but somehow comprehended on a primal level. It was calling to me, beckoning me back. I contacted a professor of linguistics at the local university, sending him the audio without explanation. His response came the next day. The language appeared to be an archaic dialect of Swiss German, and the words, as best he could translate them, were, "Time is my prison, you will be my freedom." That night I stayed at a friend's house, claiming my apartment was being fumigated. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. He was a fellow attorney, a man of facts and evidence. Like myself, or at least like I had been before the clock the following day, I returned home with a new determination. I wouldn't be driven from my house by fear. I had to understand what was happening in my study. I found the clock running perfectly, as if nothing had ever been wrong. But when I checked my phone, I realized with dawning horror that it was 11:47 p.m. 2 minutes past the time when the clock should have stopped. The ticking suddenly sounded wrong, too loud, too irregular, like a heartbeat, and it was coming from all around me. Not just from the clock, the walls seemed to pulse with each tick. The floor vibrated beneath my feet, and in the glass of the clock face I saw not my reflection, but the distorted image of a gaunt, pale face with eyes like empty clocks staring back at me. I stumbled backward, my mouth dry with terror. The face in the glass stretched and warped, its mouth opening in a silent scream, or perhaps a grin. The ticking grew louder, still drowning out every other sound. Including my own panicked breathing in desperation, I lunged for the clock and grabbed the pendulum, forcing it to stop immediately. The ticking ceased. The house fell silent for a moment. I felt relief wash over me until I realized what I had done. I had stopped the clock. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost began to form. On the windows, the breathing returned, but it was no longer coming from the hallway or any specific direction. It surrounded me as if the house itself were breathing. The shadows gathered in the center of the room, coalescing into a tall, thin figure with elongated limbs and a head that tilted at an impossible angle. "Time is mine now," it whispered in that same ancient dialect, but somehow I understood every word. Its voice sounded like gears grinding against each other through my terror. A realization dawned on me: the entity wasn't trapped in the clock. It was trapped in time, the continuous ticking. The perpetual forward motion of the hands kept it imprisoned in a loop between moments by stopping the clock. I had released it into the present with trembling hands. I reached for the pendulum again, desperate to restart it. The shadow figure glided toward me with unnatural speed, its arms extending like smoke to grasp me. I felt its cold touch on my skin like icy metal as I finally managed to set the pendulum in motion. Once more, the ticking resumed, and the figure screamed a sound like metal tearing as it was pulled back toward the clock. Its form stretched and distorted, being drawn into the mechanism itself. The frost receded from the windows. The temperature slowly returned to normal. I collapsed on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, watching as the last wisp of shadow disappeared into the clock. Faced the next day, I hired movers to carefully transport the clock to a climate-controlled storage facility where I paid for perpetual maintenance. Each month, a technician would wind it, check its accuracy, and ensure it never stopped ticking. I included detailed instructions and a substantial trust fund in my will to guarantee this arrangement would continue long after I was gone. I still live in my house, though I rarely sleep through the night. Sometimes I wake up suddenly convinced I've heard the sound of ticking coming from my walls. Other times I catch glimpses of shadows moving just beyond my peripheral vision, and on particularly quiet nights when the world around me stills, I can almost hear the faint sound of breathing, patient, persistent, waiting for the clock to stop once more. But I know better now. Time is not just a measurement. It's a prison, and some prisoners should never be set free. The first scale appeared 3 days after I found the cave, a small iridescent patch on my forearm that caught the light like mother of pearl. I told myself it was a skin condition, psoriasis, perhaps. Even as I felt its smooth, slick surface beneath my trembling fingers, but deep down I knew the sea was claiming me. Just as the voices in my dreams had promised, my name is Dr. Daniel Harmon, and until last month I was a respected coastal geologist with 23 years of field experience. Now I'm not sure what I am becoming. It began during a standard coastal erosion survey along the Massachusetts shoreline. The recent storms had reshaped sections of the coast, exposing rock formations that had been hidden for decades, possibly centuries. I was documenting a series of unusual limestone outcroppings when I noticed the narrow fissure in the cliff face, partially sealed by fallen debris. Something about its placement seemed deliberate, as if the recent landslide had been orchestrated to reveal, rather than conceal. The opening was barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, requiring me to remove my equipment pack and push it ahead of me. The walls were slick with salt water and some kind of viscous substance that left my hands coated with a greenish residue that smelled of brine and something else, something organic and ancient. My headlamp cast weak shadows along the narrowing passage as I progressed deeper. The roar of the surf growing distant behind me, the passage should have led nowhere, according to all geological surveys of the area. This section of the coastline consisted of solid granite bedrock with no significant cave systems. Yet after 20 minutes of careful navigation through the twisting corridor, the passage suddenly opened into a vast chamber that defied all logical explanation. My headlamp could barely penetrate the darkness, revealing only fragments of the space enough to sense its immensity without comprehending its dimensions. The air felt different here, dense and humid, carrying a saline heaviness that made each breath feel like drowning water. Dripped somewhere in the darkness, the sound echoing with unnatural rhythm like a heartbeat pumping through stone veins. I switched to my more powerful flood lamp, and what it revealed froze my blood. The walls were covered with petroglyphs, hundreds, perhaps thousands of crude images into the stone. Unlike any indigenous cave art I'd ever encountered, these depicted humanoid figures with distinctly non-human features, elongated limbs, oversized eyes, and what appeared to be gills lining their necks and torsos. Some showed these creatures emerging from stylized waves. Others depicted them standing among what looked like human figures in postures of supplication or worship. Most disturbing were the images that seemed to show a transformation. Human figures gradually developing the same features as the marine entities across a series of connected panels in the final images. The transformed humans were shown entering the water arms outstretched in what could have been either ecstasy or terror. The scientific part of my brain immediately cataloged possibilities. An unknown pre-Columbian cult, elaborate hoaxes, or even the effects of water erosion creating parodia patterns that my mind was interpreting as figures. But another part, the primitive hindbrain that recognizes danger before consciousness can name it, was screaming at me to leave. I should have listened instead. I continued deeper into the chamber, my lamp revealing more petroglyphs, each more detailed and disturbing than the last. At the far end of the chamber, a natural alcove had been modified to create what could only be described as an altar. A roughly circular stone table, its surface smoothed by tools or perhaps centuries of touch, held an arrangement of shell stones and what appeared to be bone fragments. They formed an intricate geometric pattern that seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles, a mathematical impossibility that I attributed to tricks of the light and my own growing unease. The centerpiece was a conch shell of unusual size and coloration, midnight blue with veins of phosphorescent green that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. Without thinking, I reached out to touch it. The shell was warm and slightly yielding like living tissue. I recoiled, nearly dropping my lamp, and in that moment of disorientation, I heard it a whisper that seemed to emanate not from any particular direction, but from the stone itself. Not words exactly, but intentions that formed meaning in my mind. Return when the moon is full. Return to us. Panic seized me. I backed away from the altar, then turned and fled through the passage, scraping my shoulders raw against the narrow walls. In my haste, by the time I emerged onto the beach, the sun was setting, painting the ocean in colors that seemed suddenly alien and threatening. I realized I had been in the cave for over 6 hours, though it had felt like less than 2 that night. I dreamt of the ocean floor not as the dark, crushing void I'd studied throughout my career, but as a luminous kingdom of strange architectures and flowing movement. I was walking among spires of coral and stone that dwarfed any human construction, breathing water as naturally as air, my body moving with a grace it had never possessed on land. I woke at dawn, sand crusting my pajamas, salt water drying on my skin, standing ankle deep in the surf. Half a mile from my rented cottage, it was the first episode of sleepwalking I'd experienced since childhood. The next night it happened again, and the next. Each time I'd wake closer to the water, the voices from my dreams still echoing in my consciousness. The tide is turning, you are becoming return when the moon is full. I started locking myself in at night first. Just the doors and windows, then progressing to tying my ankle to the bed frame with rope. It made no difference. Somehow I would still find myself on the beach come dawn, the restraints mysteriously undone with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Sometimes there would be evidence of my night journey, strange symbols drawn in the sand around me, arrangements of shells and stones that mimicked the pattern on the altar. By the 5th day, my scientific skepticism was eroding faster than the coastline. After a hurricane, I found myself obsessively checking tide charts, tracking the lunar cycle, measuring the salinity of the local water against baseline samples. I told myself I was being methodical, investigating an environmental anomaly that might explain my symptoms, Perhaps a toxic algae bloom affecting neurological function or exposure to an unknown mineral in the cave, causing hallucinations and somnambulism. But these rational explanations felt increasingly hollow as the physical changes began. The first scale was followed by others, small patches appearing on my forearms, then spreading across my chest and back. My skin grew unnaturally sensitive to dryness, requiring constant moisturizing to prevent painful cracking. I found myself drinking gallons of water daily, yet always feeling dehydrated. Most alarming was my growing aversion to being away from the ocean trips. Inland to the nearest town for supplies became torturous exercises in endurance. Beyond a certain distance from the shore, approximately 3 miles, I determined after careful testing I would experience symptoms similar to altitude sickness, shortness of breath, dizziness, nausea, and eventually unconsciousness. I contacted colleagues describing my discovery of the cave but omitting the personal changes I was experiencing. Their responses were predictably skeptical according to all official surveys and historical records. No significant cave systems existed in the area. One particularly helpful former student agreed to review my photographs of the petroglyphs, only to inform that the images I'd sent were just pictures of ordinary weathered rock surfaces. When I checked the files again, he was right where I distinctly remembered documenting detailed carvings. My camera had captured nothing but natural stone textures. My mind raced with possibilities. Was I suffering from a brain tumor? Early onset dementia? Had I been exposed to some hallucinogenic compound in the cave? Or was something systematically removing evidence of what I'd found? I began to notice I was being watched. Not by people, the coastal area was largely deserted after tourist season, but by the wildlife gulls would gather on my roof. At odd hours, their cries forming patterns too regular to be. Random schools of fish would follow me when I waded into the shallows, forming concentric circles around my legs once waking from sleepwalking. Before dawn, I observed what appeared to be seals sitting in a semicircle on the beach around me, their eyes reflecting my flashlight with unnatural intelligence, before they silently slipped back into the waves as the full moon approached. My transformation accelerated. The scales now covered nearly 40% of my body. My eyes had developed a secondary membrane, transparent but visible, sliding horizontally across my vision. When submerged in water, instantly correcting my sight. My fingers had grown slightly webbed between the second knuckles. I discovered I could hold my breath underwater for nearly 7 minutes without distress. I should have been horrified instead. I found myself fascinated, meticulously documenting each change with scientific detachment, as if studying a subject other than myself at times. I even felt a perverse pride in my evolving physiology, a sense that I was becoming something more adapted, more evolved than my former self. The rational part of my brain, the part that still identified as Dr. Daniel Harmon, geologist and man of science, knew I should seek medical help immediately. But that voice was growing fainter against the chorus that filled my dreams, promising revelation and belonging. If only I would return to the cave when the moon was full. Return and complete what had begun. Last night was the full moon. I fought against its pull with every remaining shred of my humanity. I barricaded myself in the bathroom, the only room without window. Windows swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills and handcuffed myself to the pipes beneath the sink. As consciousness faded, I felt a grim satisfaction in having thwarted whatever force was calling me to the cave. I woke at the altar. The cave was transformed by moonlight, filtering through some unseen opening above, illuminating the chamber with an ethereal blue glow that set the patterns on the altar pulsing with life. The midnight blue conch shell now emanated a light of its own, casting shadows that moved independently of any physical source. I wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the darkness. Beyond the altar, humanoid but fluid, their features obscured but their presence unmistakable. I sensed rather than saw their eyes upon me, felt their anticipation like an electric current in the water. Heavy air, the voice that had been a whisper in my dreams, now surrounded me, emanating from the stone, the shells, the very air itself, and from something within me as well. The tide turns, the cycle renews the landform, falls away, the sea form ascends. My scientific mind made a final desperate attempt to categorize what was happening. A mass hallucination, a complex delusion, a psychotic break. But these clinical terms seemed ridiculous in the face of the profound transformation occurring within and around me. The scales across my body began to illuminate, matching the phosphorescent patterns on the altar. The pain I expected never came instead. A sensation of profound rightness washed over me as the final barrier between my consciousness and the calling I'd been resisting crumbled away. I understood then what the petroglyphs had been showing. Not an invasion or parasitic takeover, but a communion as old as the relationship between land and sea, a cyclical transformation that had occurred countless times throughout human history, calling those with the right genetic heritage. Back to their original form, my ancestors had come from the depths eons ago, adapted to land-built civilizations, but always maintained this sacred place of return. Every third generation, the call would come to one who carried the strongest trace of the original genetic memory. I was simply the latest in a lineage stretching back to when the first life forms crawled from the primordial oceans. As revelation washed over me, I felt my remaining humanity not being erased but transcended. The patterns on the altar suddenly made perfect mathematical sense, a multi-dimensional equation mapping the transformation from one form to another preserved in sacred geometry. When written language had not yet existed, I knew I had a choice. Even now I could fight the transformation, perhaps even reverse it partially with the right medical intervention, or I could surrender to it completely, enter the waters beyond the cave and join my ancestors in the deep. Places they had never truly abandoned. The moon reaches its zenith. The decision is upon me. Even as I write these final notes, a scientist to the end documenting what cannot be fully understood, I feel the tides changing within me. The water calls and the journal ends here. The final words trailing off into a series of increasingly illegible marks that resemble neither human writing nor random scrolls, but something deliberately patterned like waves across us. You know, the mirror watches me as I watch it, ancient, ornate, and wrong in ways I can't articulate even now as I write these words by the dim light of my desk lamp. I feel its presence down the hall, a silent gravity pulling at my consciousness. 3 weeks ago, I was merely Professor Daniel Harmon, linguistics expert at Blackwood University. Now I'm something else, a prisoner, a conduit, perhaps something worse. This mirror has changed me, or perhaps it's revealing what was always there. Waiting beneath the surface of everything I thought I knew, the antique shop stood wedged between a modern coffee house and a vacant storefront on Caldwell Street in the oldest part of the city, where cobblestones still peek through worn asphalt. I had just finished a particularly frustrating faculty meeting and found myself wandering the historic district, my mind still churning over departmental politics and budget cuts. The shop's window display caught my eye not for its beauty but for its academic intrigue, a collection of artifacts bearing inscriptions and what appeared to be a pre-Sumerian script I'd never encountered. My specialty is ancient Mediterranean languages with a focus on extinct writing systems. The sight of unfamiliar symbols always quickens my pulse. I entered the shop, the brass bell above the door announcing my arrival with a discordant jingle that seemed to hang in the air too long. The proprietor, an elderly man with skin like parchment and eyes recessed deep within dark sockets, barely acknowledged me as I browsed the shop, smelled of dust sandalwood and something metallic like old pennies. I later recognized this as the scent of oxidized mirror backing, but at the time it merely added to the atmosphere of forgotten things. Then I saw it leaning against the far wall, partially concealed by a threadbare tapestry, a full-length mirror in an ornate bronze frame approximately 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. The frame featured intricate carvings of intertwined serpents and symbols that, despite my expertise, I couldn't immediately identify. They resembled no language. Family ID studied not Indo-European, not Semitic, not even logographic systems like ancient Chinese. Yet they conveyed a distinct sense of meaning, of intentionality. The price tag, Read 750 steep for an impulse purchase, but not unreasonable for a potentially significant linguistic artifact. When I inquired about its provenance, the shopkeeper's demeanor shifted subtly. His voice remained monotone, but his eyes narrowed as he explained that it had belonged to Ambrose Sullivan, a name that triggered a distant memory from my doctoral studies. Sullivan had been a controversial figure in occult circles. In the late 1800s, a mathematician and astronomer who eventually abandoned academia for esoteric pursuits. Rumors persisted that he had discovered mathematical formulas that allowed for communication with other planes of existence. The scientific community had dismissed him as a madman, and he disappeared from public record around 1897. The shopkeeper mentioned that Sullivan had commissioned the mirror from an unknown craftsman, allegedly incorporating symbols from texts not meant for human understanding. He then fell silent, his gaze drifting to the floor. When I pressed for more information, he simply shrugged and stated that the mirror had been in his inventory for nearly 20 years. No one seemed interested in such a heavy, ornate piece against my better judgment, or perhaps because of some subconscious pull I didn't yet recognize. I purchased it. The transaction felt oddly ceremonial. The shopkeeper wrapped it carefully in brown paper and twine, his fingers never touching the glass or frame directly as I struggled to load it into my car. He watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. My apartment occupies the third floor of a converted Victorian home near campus. High ceilings, hardwood floors, and walls, thick enough to muffle the sounds of neighboring units. I'm a solitary man by nature, having divorced 12 years ago and settled into the comfortable routine of academic bachelorhood. My living space reflects this minimal furniture, overflowing bookshelves, and the accumulated artifacts of research trips abroad. I installed the mirror in my study opposite my desk, thinking the symbols would provide inspiration for a new research paper. Perhaps I could connect Sullivan's obscure symbology to established linguistic traditions, rehabilitating his academic reputation posthumous. The first 3 days passed. Uneventfully, I photographed the symbols, created digital tracings, and cross-referenced them against every writing system in my extensive database. Nothing matched. Not even partial correlations emerged. The symbols defied categorization, exhibiting characteristics of both phonetic and ideographic systems. While conforming to neither on the fourth night, I noticed something unusual as I prepared to leave my study. My reflection moved a fraction of a second after I did. Not the normal delay of perception, but a distinct lag, as if my image were reluctant to follow. I blinked and the phenomenon vanished. Tired eyes. Reasoned and too much coffee. The following morning, I avoided looking at the mirror as I entered my study, focusing instead on grading papers. Midterm season always brings a crushing workload. Hours passed before I glanced up and noticed my reflection seemed slightly off. Not in movement this time, but in position. My hand rested on my cheek, but my reflection's hand appeared to be an inch lower. When I jerked my hand away, my reflection followed instantly, perfectly synchronized. Once more, I approached the mirror, cautiously examining its surface for imperfections that might distort the image. The glass was flawless, with none of the waviness common in antique mirrors. I placed my palm against the cool surface, and my reflection did the same. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that something about the contact felt wrong, as if I were touching something alive and barely restrained. That night I dreamed of drowning in black water while something with too many limbs pulled me deeper. I woke gasping sheets soaked with sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. As my breathing slowed, I became aware of a sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from my study down the hall. Whispering, multiple voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. My apartment has no shared walls in the direction of my study. No plumbing runs through that section. No logical explanation presented itself yet. The whispers continued, rising and falling in rhythmic patterns that suggested language rather than random noise. My body felt leaden as I forced myself out of bed. My mouth had gone desert dry, and each heartbeat pulsed in my ears as I moved down the darkened hallway. The whispers grew clearer, still indecipherable but unmistakably speech-like. They emanated from behind my closed study door. I stood paralyzed, hand on the doorknob for what seemed like an eternity. The rational part of my brain inventoried possible explanations. A radio left on an open window carrying voices from outside pipes settling in the old building. Yet I knew with sick certainty that none of these would prove true when I finally pushed the door open. The room was pitch black, except for a faint silvery glow coming from the mirror. The whispers stopped abruptly. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling so violently that I missed it twice before flooding the room with harsh fluorescent light. The mirror appeared normal, just glass and metal, reflecting my own terrified face. Pale and sweat-streaked, I searched the room thoroughly, checking windows, locked vents secure, and my computer off, finding nothing unusual. I convinced myself it had been an elaborate auditory hallucination brought on by stress and interrupted sleep. I left the light on and returned to bed, where I lay awake until dawn. Over the next week, the incidents escalated in frequency and intensity. My reflection began to exhibit subtle differences, a slightly different posture, a delayed reaction, once even what appeared to be a different facial expression when viewed from the corner of my eye. The whispers returned nightly, always between 3 and 4 a.m., growing increasingly urgent. Though remaining just beyond comprehension, I began researching Ambrose Sullivan, obsessively requesting rare manuscripts through interlibrary loan and accessing digitized newspaper archives. What emerged was the portrait of a brilliant man's descent into obsession. Sullivan had started as a respected mathematician before becoming fixated on what he called non-Euclidean communicative geometries, mathematical formulas that supposedly allowed information to pass between dimensions. His journals, largely dismissed as the ravings of a deteriorating mind, described experiments with reflective surfaces as permeable boundaries between worlds. He claimed to have made contact with entities from another plane of existence, beings who shared knowledge of a language that transcended human cognitive limitations. Most disturbing was his final journal entry dated 3 days before his disappearance. The glass thins, they are coming through. I have seen myself on the other side, and it is glorious and terrible sleep became nearly impossible. I installed a camera facing the mirror, hoping to capture evidence of the anomalies. Each morning I reviewed the footage, finding nothing but occasional digital glitches, strange pixelation around the mirror's frame. Unexplained timecode, jumps moments of complete signal loss. My colleagues began commenting on my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, my jumpiness, my tendency to trail off. Mid-sentence, I canceled classes. Claiming illness, in reality, I couldn't bear to leave my apartment for fear of what might happen in my absence. I began covering the mirror with a sheet during the day, but each morning I felt compelled to remove it to check if anything had changed last night. Everything escalated beyond my capacity for rational explanation. I had finally fallen into exhausted sleep around midnight when the whispers woke me. Louder than ever and accompanied by a rhythmic tapping, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 the sound of knuckles against glass. My body moved on, autopilot drawn down the hallway toward my study. The door stood open, though I distinctly remembered closing it. The sheet I had draped over the mirror lay crumpled on the floor in the darkness. The mirror's surface glowed with a phosphorescent blue light that illuminated nothing around. Found it, and my reflection was wrong. It stood differently, shoulders squared. Where mine slumped, head tilted inquisitively. Where mine hung heavy with exhaustion when I raised my hand in stunned disbelief. My reflection remained still, watching me with my own eyes that somehow no longer belonged to me. It smiled. I did not cold sweat erupted across my skin. My lungs seized, unable to draw breath. Every instinct screamed for me to run, yet I remained frozen. Caught in the gaze of this thing wearing my face slowly, deliberately. My reflection raised its hand and pressed its palm against the inside of the glass. The surface rippled like disturbed water. The whispers crescendoed, resolving suddenly into comprehensible English. Let me through. Let me replace you. You've seen how much better I wear your life. My paralysis broke. I stumbled backwards, slamming into my desk hard enough to send books cascading to the floor as I scrambled among them. My hand closed around a heavy bronze paperweight, a gift from my ex-wife during happier times, acting on pure instinct. I hurled it at the mirror with all my strength. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. A spiderweb of fractures spreading from the point of impact. A horrible shriek erupted. Not from the mirror, but seemingly from the walls themselves. The floor, the ceiling, a multi-dimensional howl of rage and frustration. My reflection fragmented across the cracked surface, each shard containing a different piece of my face, my body, yet somehow horrifyingly. Each fragment moved independently, twisting at impossible angles, pressing against the damaged barrier fingers, my fingers, but not mine. Probed at the cracks, testing their strength. I fled the apartment with nothing but my phone, my wallet, and the clothes I wore. I drove aimlessly until sunrise, eventually finding myself at this roadside motel 50 miles from the city. I haven't slept. I can't. I've written everything down because I need someone to know what happened, what's still happening. The mirror didn't shatter completely. The barrier is damaged but not destroyed. And whatever waits on the other side is angry. Now I've been researching Sullivan's final days on my laptop, according to local newspaper archives. After his disappearance, his home was searched. They found his possessions untouched. No signs of struggle or planned departure, with one exception. Every mirror in his house had been shattered. The fragments meticulously removed every mirror except one, which was never recovered. I know what I have to do. I'll return to my apartment today armed with tools to destroy the mirror completely. I must obliterate every fragment, every shard that might serve as a gateway. Sullivan understood too late what I now know: some boundaries must remain uncrossed. Some reflections unseen as I prepare to check out of this motel. I avoid the bathroom mirror. I've draped a towel over it, but still, I feel observed, and when I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the darkened screen of my laptop, just for an instant before the text editor filled the display, I could swear it blinked without me. Perhaps that's just paranoia. Perhaps the boundary has already been breached in ways I don't yet understand. Perhaps I'm already on the wrong side of the glass. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a technical glitch. Now I know better. Something waits for me in that elevator after hours. Something that has been watching, learning, and slowly revealing a world beyond the thin veneer of our reality. A world that hungers, a world that wants me to join it permanently. I've always been the last to leave the office as Chief Financial Officer at Meridian Capital. My dedication to the company translated into 18-hour workdays that left me alone in our 40-story downtown building long after the cleaning staff had gone. I used to take pride in that dedication. Now I understand it was merely bait in an elaborate trap. The building's elevator system was state-of-the-art when installed 15 years ago. A sleek brushed steel affair with digital displays and whisper-quiet hydraulics. 3 months ago, I noticed the first anomaly. It was nearly midnight, and I was heading down from our offices on the 38th floor. The digital display showed the expected descent, 38, 37, 36, but then it flickered between 28 and an unfamiliar symbol that resembled a distorted figure 8. My stomach lurched, not from the descent, but from a sudden, inexplicable sense of wrongness. The elevator slowed to a stop, though I hadn't pressed any buttons for intermediate floors. The doors opened onto a floor I didn't recognize. The layout was similar. 2 our corporate floors, but the lighting was different. A sickly greenish fluorescence that cast everything in a jace. Hall, the air felt heavy, almost gelatinous in my lungs. No one occupied the workstations, yet papers rustled and chair wheels occasionally squeaked as if an invisible workforce toiled in the empty space. My skin prickled with goosebumps, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I jabbed repeatedly at the lobby button, my heart hammering against my ribcage until the doors finally closed. I convinced myself it was exhaustion, playing tricks on my perception. The next day, I casually asked our building manager about renovations on the 28th floor. He looked at me strangely, reminding me that our building went from the 27th floor directly to the 29th. A concession to the superstitions of our building's original Japanese investors who considered 8 an unlucky number. There was no 28th floor. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, the elevator stopped at what the display showed as floor icon until the doors opened to reveal a narrow corridor with walls that seemed to pulse slightly, like the interior of something living. The carpet beneath the threshold appeared sodden. Though there was no visible moisture, it simply yielded like wet moss. When I cautiously extended my foot to test it, from somewhere down the hallway came a sound like wet clothing being wrung out, punctuated by a rhythmic clicking. My mouth went bone dry, my tongue sticking to the roof of my mouth as I frantically pressed the door close button. I began taking the stairs after that incident, 28 flights down my thighs, burning and lungs heaving by the time I reached the lobby. This lasted nearly 2 weeks until a late-night thunderstorm triggered a partial power outage. The emergency generators kicked in, but the stairwell doors automatically locked a security feature to prevent unauthorized access during outages. My only way down was the elevator. I stood before the brushed steel doors. My reflection distorted and wavering as if seen through water. My hand trembled as I pressed the call button. The wait seemed interminable, each second stretching into uncomfortable minutes. When the elevator finally arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed obscenely out of place, I found myself staring into an empty car that somehow felt occupied. The descent began normally 38, 37, 36. My muscles tensed with each floor, and anticipating the moment when normality would fracture at the 23rd floor, the lights flickered. The digital display scrambled, showing random segments before settling on an impossible arrangement to the elevator. Didn't slow so much as sink like a stone through thick oil. My ears popped painfully, and the temperature plummeted until I could see my breath fogging in front of my face. When the doors opened, I faced a vast open floor that couldn't possibly fit within the building's footprint. The space stretched into shadow-cloaked distance, the far walls invisible beyond the reach of the meager light spilling from the elevator pillars of what appeared to be dark-veined marble. Rose to a ceiling lost in darkness. Between them moved shapes, fluid and constant things that seemed assembled from scraps of shadow and shimmering fragments that might have been eyes or teeth, or neither. My heart pounded so violently I felt lightheaded, the rush of blood in my ears nearly deafening. I wanted to flee, to retreat into the elevator, but my body refused to respond. I remained frozen in place as one of the shapes noticed me and began drifting closer. It moved with a terrible purpose, reshaping itself as it approached sprouting limbs that were almost arms, developing a bulbous protrusion that approximated a head within. That head shape crevices opened to reveal glistening surfaces that reflected my terrified face. Back at me, multiplied and distorted, a sound emanated from the thing not created by anything as mundane as vocal cords. It resonated directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely, a series of concepts rather than words conveying a hungry curiosity. I felt it probing at the edges of my consciousness. Searching for weaknesses for a way in the elevator doors finally closed. Severing the connection, I collapsed against the rear wall, gasping for breath, my shirt soaked with cold sweat. The display returned to normal, resuming its countdown to the lobby when I finally staggered out into the night air. I nearly kissed the filthy sidewalk out of sheer gratitude. I should have quit my job the next day. I drafted a resignation email, my fingers shaking so badly I had to correct every other word. But then our CEO announced the Peterson acquisition, a deal I'd spent 3 years orchestrating, the crowning achievement of my career. Walking away meant abandoning my substantial completion. Bonus, my stock options just weeks from vesting. I deleted the draft instead. I arranged to sleep on the office sofa on late nights, avoiding the elevator entirely. This worked until the building management implemented new security protocols requiring all floors to be vacated by midnight. No exceptions. I tried booking hotel rooms nearby, but the family rationality of daylight made my fears seem childish. The financial waste became another reason to dismiss what I'd experienced as stress-induced hallucinations. I cautiously resumed using the elevator, but only during the day, only with others present last Tuesday. A board meeting ran long. By the time we finished, it was 11:47 p.m. The other executives headed to the parking garage via the dedicated express elevator, but my car was in the shop I needed. Did the main elevator to reach the lobby, my colleagues noticed my hesitation and inquired if I was feeling unwell. Not wanting to appear unstable, I assured them I was fine. Just tired as their elevator doors closed, I felt a crushing sense of isolation settle over me. The empty corridor stretched before me, the overhead lights dimming automatically for energy conservation, leaving pools of shadow between islands of feeble illumination. The elevator dinged its arrival before I pressed the call button. My mouth filled with the metallic taste of fear as the door slid open to reveal an empty car I considered making a run for the stairs. Security locks be damned, but pride and stubborn rationality pushed me forward. I stepped inside, immediately pressing L for lobby and the door close button simultaneously, as if speed could outrun whatever waited between floors. The door slid shut with deliberate slowness. I fixed my eyes on the digital display, watching the numbers count down with painful precision at the 32nd floor. The overhead light began to pulse gently, like the slow breathing of a sleeping predator. I placed my hand against the wall to steady myself, only to jerk it away when I felt the subtle movement beneath my palm, a shift of metal and plastic that suggested muscles flexing beneath skin. The air thickened with a smell like ozone and copper pennies between the 29th and 27th floors, there being no 28th. The descent halted with a lurch that sent me stumbling against the rear wall. The digital display flickered rapidly through symbols I'd never seen before, eventually stabilizing on one that resembled a vertical eye. My reflection in the brushed steel doors stretched and compressed my features, melting and reforming in impossible configurations. A voice whispered from the speaker system. Not the standard automated announcement, but something intimate and multi-layered, as if several people spoke in precise unison. It didn't use English or any language I recognized, yet somehow I understood the invitation it extended to step out, to explore, to transcend the limitations of my ordinary existence. The doors opened onto absolute darkness. Not the absence of light, but something active and alive. Darkness with depth and texture and intention. From within that perfect blackness emerged slender tendrils of luminescence, weaving complex patterns that hypnotically beckoned my body. Responded to their call, one foot sliding forward without conscious command. I bit down hard on my tongue, the sharp pain breaking the compulsion. Blood filled my mouth, its iron taste anchoring me to reality, or what I desperately hoped was reality. With tremendous effort, I wrenched my arm up to punch repeatedly at the lobby button. Nothing happened. I then struck every button on the panel in panic succession. The darkness began flowing into the elevator like liquid night pooling around my shoes where it touched. I felt a vibration that resonated with something deep inside me, some fundamental frequency of my being. With rising horror, I realized it wasn't trying to consume me. It was trying to harmonize with me, to tune me to its reality. In desperation, I wedged my fingers into the narrow gap between the elevator doors and pulled with strength. Born of primal terror, the muscles in my back screamed in protest as the doors grudgingly yielded a few inches. The darkness retreated slightly, seemingly confused by my resistance. I forced my body through the opening, scraping skin from my shoulders and hips, tumbling onto solid floor. Beyond, I found myself in a service corridor I'd never seen before. Concrete floors, exposed pipes running along the ceiling. The steady hum of machinery. A maintenance worker stared at me in shock. His sandwich halfway to his mouth. I must have looked deranged, sweating, bleeding from my self-inflicted tongue wound, clothes disheveled from forcing myself through the doors. I managed to stammer something about the elevator malfunctioning, the worker concerned, but clearly uncomfortable, directed me to a service stairwell that would take me to the lobby. I thanked him profusely, restraining an impulse to hug this beautiful, normal human being before leaving. I glanced back at the elevator through the gap I'd created. I saw not darkness, but a normal, empty elevator car. The display showed it was now headed up, stopping at floors where no one waited. Doors opening onto empty hallways, searching. I realized with nauseating certainty, for another late-working soul, I left my resignation letter on my boss's desk that night along with my security badge. I've ignored his increasingly confused and then angry messages. My career at Meridian Capital is over, along with a bonus and stock options. Some prices are too high to pay. I've taken a new position at a small firm with modest offices in a two-story building. I walk up and down the single flight of stairs a dozen times daily, grateful for their unchanging concrete solidity. I leave promptly at 5 o'clock each day, though it means taking work home sometimes at night. I dream of those luminous tendrils reaching out from the darkness in the dreams I don't resist. I step forward, allowing myself to be recalibrated, reformed into something that can exist in that impossible space. I wake from these dreams neither frightened nor comforted, but with a lingering sense of interrupted transformation. Yesterday, I received a disturbing email from a former colleague still at Meridian. The building management has apparently commissioned a significant upgrade to the elevator system. The new technology features adaptive artificial intelligence that learns from usage patterns to improve efficiency. The test phase begins next month. I've deleted the email and blocked the sender. Some knowledge isn't meant for us, some doors are better left closed, and some invitations should never be accepted, no matter how enticing the opportunity they present.